Chapter 692, Suspect. Seeing everyone on the Golden Dream aim their sights at Anderson, Klein took a step forward and said to Danitz, his side facing him, "Bring me to the captain's cabin." "All right. All right." Danitz retracted his angry glare aimed at Anderson Hood. "Prioritize captain's rescue. Prioritize captain's rescue," he kept repeating to himself. The Golden Dream first released a dinghy before lowering a gangway, allowing Klein to easily step onto the deck without using a charm. Anderson followed by his side, completely ignoring the glares of the Golden Dream's crew. With a smile, he strolled forward as he looked around, treating it as his own home. His mental fortitude is truly beyond remarkable. Yes, even after offending a demigod where he was forced to apologize in public and accept a mission, he was able to laugh at himself and enjoy a meal. Klein sighed inwardly as he walked towards third mate Jodson and company. "Hello, Mr. Sparrow. I'm this ship's first mate, Brew Walls." A 1.8-meter tall man with a monocle politely bowed. "The pirate, Gourmet, who's worth 6,200 pounds. The bounties on Vice Admiral Iceberg's pirate crew are clearly lower than Admiral of Stars. They live up to being treasure hunters who happen to be part-time pirates." Klein greeted him using Gehrman Sparrow's style of politeness. "Hello. I've heard about you." "Huh, it's my honor. I'm only a treasure hunter who dreams to be an artisan, but I ended up having to be a gourmet," Brewall said in a self-deprecating manner. He pointed to the man beside him and said, "Our second mate, Singer Orpheus. Bounty of 5,500 pounds. The Beyonders on the Golden Dream all have very odd nicknames. I didn't know that they were the subordinates of a pirate admiral. I would have definitely believed them to be a traveling crew who sing and enjoy good food while holding bonfires as they seek out legendary treasure. It's truly a beautiful life." Klein cast his gaze at Orpheus and nodded. The singer had deep sculpted outlines and a head of resplendent blonde hair. He said with a sad smile, "Actually, I'm only praising the sun, but now, my sun has disappeared." Klein nearly felt goosebumps all over him. Tisk, as expected of someone from Intis. He speaks like he's singing. What a pity, I grew up in Seeger, in Lemberg, and didn't pick up this ability, Anderson said with a chuckle. It wasn't clear if he was praising or degrading Orpheus. After all, half the blood flowing in his veins was Intis blood. Born in Senior and later studied in Lemberg. Yes, it was likely a church school. He's classmates with Vice Admiral Iceberg Edwina. Mr. Orpheus is definitely from the Sun Pathway, but he's unlikely to be from the Church of the Eternal Blazing Sunday. From his bounty, he's likely a Sequence 6 notary. I almost forgot to inform Little Sun that I have his formula. I wonder what he will use in exchange this time. Klein turned towards Flowery Bow-Tie Jodson and Bucket Daniels before Gourmet Brew Walls introduced. "We've met. Let's not waste any time." "All right." Brew Walls heaved a sigh of relief, stroked his short beard and led the way into the cabin. If it wasn't for how famous Gehrman Sparrow was on the ship, he wouldn't have been that polite. At that moment, Anderson deliberately stayed behind, walking alongside Danitz, Orpheus, and company. He looked to his left and right, unfazed by how the surrounding pirates looked like they wanted to rip him apart. He laughed with a TSK. "The one you should be wary of isn't me." "Yes, we aren't wary of you. We only want to stuff you in. See that? Into that cannon." Danitz wasn't afraid that Anderson was the strongest hunter. After all, they were on the Golden Dream. There were plenty of pirates, and many of them were Sequence 6 or 7 Beyonders. Anderson curled his lips. "I'm actually not a threat. Think about it, your captain definitely hates and detests me. She wouldn't even want to speak to me. Isn't that ideal?" Danitz turned agape, but he didn't say a thing. He suddenly felt that what the pile of dogs hit said made sense. The looks in the eyes of Orpheus, Jodson, and company also subconsciously turned gentle. Anderson chuckled as he looked at them. He said in a rather ethereal tone, "The person you should be wary about is Gehrman Sparrow." "Why?" Danitz blurted out. Although he's a madman that warrants the need to be wary of him, he's not an enemy at the moment. Danitz silently added. Anderson laughed. I'm assuming that Gehrman successfully finds your captain and rescues her. Will your captain have fond feelings for him as a result? Besides, he looks pretty good. He has that cold and aloof aesthetic and is strong. He's at the level of a pirate admiral, and his background is especially mysterious. He's completely compatible. How is it possible? Danitz wished to retort, but he was momentarily at a loss for words. He felt increasingly more convinced that things weren't right. Orpheus and company had their expressions collapse bit by bit. They looked at Gehrman Sparrow's back with a newfound sense of wariness. Resolved. The provocation problem from before has been resolved. With a smile, Anderson walked into the cabin. When he arrived inside the captain's cabin, Klein first circled the room, which was nearly filled with bookshelves. On it were all kinds of books. The average captain's cabin is filled with racks of alcohol, he silently mumbled before walking straight to the desk by the window. According to Danitz's description, Edwina had vanished during her research. Therefore, finding traces of her research was Klein's goal. After he gathered enough information, he would head above the gray fog to divine the matter. At that moment, the desk was a mess with many things placed on it. There was white paper, a fountain pen, an ink bottle, a bronze dagger, and untidily stacked books. In the middle of the desk was a book made of goatskin. Its dark brown cover had the words, Grosel's Travels, written in ancient Faisac. Isn't this one of Vice Admiral Iceberg's collections? It has a mysterious origin and is suspected to be related to the dragons and City of Miracles, Liveseed. Edwina was studying this before she disappeared. Klein looked at the book and instinctively made a guess. Seeing Gehrman Sparrow study the ancient book, Danitz forced a smile and said, There's nothing wrong with it. We have already inspected it. Is that so? I seriously doubt your meticulousness. Since someone had flipped it and there weren't any obvious abnormalities with it, together with the fact that Klein determined that Danitz was saying the truth with his spiritual intuition, Klein reached out for it and asked, Have you read Grosel's Travels? Danitz shook his head. Brew Walls, Orpheus, Jodson, and company shook their heads as well. Their expressions seemed to say that their daily studies were tiring enough. They didn't wish to read any other books during their breaks. Swiping his fingertip across the yellowish-brown goatskin, Klein carefully and seriously read each page. Soon, he arrived at the spot where the pages were stuck together. From the corner of his eye, he saw what was written in it. That's not right. His gaze focused as he hurriedly flipped 2 pages back. He clearly remembered that his previous read stopped at Giant Grosel and his team preparing to challenge the Frost Dragon, the King of the North, in a head-on clash. There was nothing after that, but now, there were 2 more pages. It also meant that the stuck pages had thinned, and the book had 2 more pages. The chapters came to a halt for 1,000 years before it was continued. These are the fruits of Vice Admiral Iceberg's research. This also led to her disappearance. As Klein lampooned, he frowned as he read the additional content. The 2 pages described a lost female pirate. She encountered the King of the North in a blizzard, and she was nearly killed. Only by using all her strength was she successful in escaping before meeting the main lead's team who were here to challenge the Frost Dragon. There's the addition of a female pirate. Female pirate. Klein ruminated over this description as an idea suddenly came to him. Could she be Vice Admiral Iceberg Edwina? She entered the book and became a character in the story. With this idea in mind, Klein quickly realized certain problems. Rhodes mentioned before that the past owners of Grosel's Travels vanished. Grosel's Travels has a giant from the Dark Epoch, which is also the second epoch, an elf, an ascetic from the third or fourth epoch, a Solomon Empire noble, and a fifth epoch lone soldier. The times are extremely chaotic. If they were all the past owners of Grosel's Travels who disappeared, that will solve the problem. They do not belong to the same period, and they were swallowed by the book, becoming a character in the story. Klein found his theory ridiculous as he thought about it, but it was highly likely. In the world of mysticism, this isn't impossible. I have to confirm it. Besides, what did Edwina and the past owners do to be swallowed by the book? And what should I do to release them? Klein retracted his gaze and thought deeply in silence. Soon, he looked up at Danitz and company. Prepare items like candles. I will be praying for an answer from a secret existence. And that secret existence is myself. Klein added inwardly in jest. He really is professional and crazy. Gourmet Brew Walls and company didn't dare to speak further. They hurriedly provided the materials before leaving the captain's cabin. They didn't dare to watch such dangerous rituals unless Gehrman Sparrow requested them to do so. Inside the captain's cabin, Klein locked the door, closed the windows, and quickly set up the ritual. Then, he brought Groselle's travels above the gray fog. After placing the ancient book at the end of the long bronze table, he sat down and conjured a pen and paper. He then scribbled a divination statement. Edwina is in the story of this book. Chapter 693, Attempt. After putting down the fountain pen in his hand, Klein removed the spirit pendulum from his left wrist, holding it in one hand and letting it hang down over the paper in close proximity. Edwina is in the story of this book. Klein closed his eyes and silently repeated the divination statement. After he recited the statement, he opened his eyes and saw the topaz pendant spinning clockwise. This meant that Vice Admiral Iceberg Edwina was inside Groselle's travels. It really is a world inside a book. Furthermore, the situation inside is very special. Without new characters, the story isn't able to continue. Klein indiscernibly nodded. Wounding the silver chain and the topaz pendant around his wrist again, he picked up a dark red fountain pen and wrote a new divination statement, the method to entering Groselle's travels. This time, he used dream divination. In the gray, hazy world, he saw indistinct figures. The figures were of varying sizes, some huge, others slender. The thing all of them had in common was that they held a book with pages of yellowish-brown goatskin. The following developments branched off into two scenarios. A number of them vanished silently with Groselle's travels on them. The others would accidentally or deliberately drip their blood on the cover while carrying Groselle's travels with them before suddenly vanishing. The scene shattered and Klein opened his eyes to see the modeled table in front of him. He frowned as he made an interpretation. To enter or activate Groselle's travels, it either needs prolonged contact with it to a certain extent, or you would need to drip one's blood onto the cover. Isn't that too simple? Perhaps, it's really that simple. In the story, the lone soldier's first appearance was as an ordinary person who didn't know mysticism. With the help of his companions, he slowly became a disciplinary paladin. Therefore, the activation method isn't too complicated. An ordinary person is able to accomplish it. A small number of researchers before this, including Vice Admiral Iceberg Edwina, were beyonders with sufficient amounts of mysticism knowledge. They knew not to rashly drip their blood, otherwise, death might occur without them even knowing it. This is akin to ordinary people using the correct form of magic mirror divination. It's very easy to provoke a powerful existence or secret existence. It's why no problems happen to them. Furthermore, Edwina keeps Groselle's travels in the collector's room most of the time and only interacts with it occasionally. As such, it was only when she recently had a new research concept that she had prolonged contact with it, completing the condition required to activate the book. Yes, even Rhodes only knew that there's something strange with the book. Many of the past owners had vanished, and it's suspected to have something to do with the Dragons and City of Miracles, Liveseed. This means that Groselle's travels will interfere with its surroundings when being activated. Therefore, most of the collectors in the past do not know of its problem and had no thoughts of studying it. The owners who disappeared likely aren't limited to the ones in the story. The others might have died for all kinds of reasons, failing to leave their names in the book. Klein focused again and made another divination, hoping to obtain the method to leave Groselle's travels. This time, he saw a more tempestuous blizzard in the gray, hazy dreamscape. He saw a gigantic figure at the top of an ice peak. It was a translucent dragon who remained nearly 5 meters tall while standing on all fours. It resembled a lizard's cousin and had an ugly face with eerie blue eyes. It had a thick, powerful tail and a pair of gigantic wings covered in a skin membrane on its back. It seemed to blot out the sky simply by spreading its wings. Its scales resembled ice crystals as they swirled with a crystalline glow. It was the most beautiful and dreamy part of its entire body. Suddenly, the dragon, which resembled an ice sculpture, raised its neck and body, and it let out a terrifying roar that penetrated through the blizzard. At that moment, it reached 10 meters tall by standing up on its hind legs. King of the North. That frost dragon. Klein left the dream and tapped the armrest of the high-back chair. His interpretation of the divination revelation was that the key to leaving Grozel's travels lay with the King of the North. Klein's initial guess was that only by helping the main lead, Grozel, accomplish his goal, slaying the frost dragon, would the story come to a complete end, opening a passageway to exit the book. However, I can also attempt to see if I can forcibly break open the barrier between the world in the book and the real world. Klein relied on his rich experience to quickly come up with an attempt. He first picked up the Black Emperor card, which was facing down, and he infused it into his spirit body. Suddenly, Klein's body was covered in black full-body armor. On his head was a heavy crown as his aura became majestic and dignified. It exuded an awe-inspiring vibe. Following that, he stirred the powers of the mysterious space above the gray fog to the limit, making them surge over like a tidal wave. Upon seeing this scene, Klein didn't hesitate to summon the sea god's scepter from the junk pile before he infused his spirituality within. The blue gems on the end of the bone scepter lit up one after another, emitting a blinding luster. Countless silver bolts of lightning surfaced as they zapped about the grand palace as though they were forming a sea of lightning. Finally, Klein used the suppressive power and balance from the Black Emperor's loftiness to infuse the stirred powers into the lightning storm. Rumble. Thunder resonated above the gray fog and into the distance as thick bolts of lightning smote down, striking Grozel's travels. Blinding light enveloped the entire palace for a full 20 seconds. After everything was over, Klein looked at the target again and discovered the model table was in shambles. As for the dark brown leather book, it was completely unharmed. Only its ends curled up a little. It's far more impressive than I imagined. That's right, how can an item which can create a whole new book world be simple? I wouldn't have made a loss buying it for £8,000 back then. It can be used as a shield. It can definitely defend against attacks from saints. The only problem is its tiny size. It won't be able to shield much. Klein's thoughts raced as the bronze table was quickly restored to normal. Since there was no way to forcibly tear open the barrier between the world inside the book and the real world, he could only consider how to enter it according to the normal procedures. Get some blood, bring it up here and smear it across the cover, and then enter as a spirit body with the Blood Emperor card and Sea God Scepter. This way, I don't have to worry about encountering King of the Five Seas, Nast, as there's no way he can sense it. He won't be able to enter the world inside the book either. But the problem lies in the fact that rescuing Vice Admiral Iceberg this way will allow her to determine that Gehrman Sparrow is Hero Bandit Black Emperor. Yes, there's a more important problem. Entering with a spirit body means that the body is still in the outside world, the captain's cabin of the Golden Dream. I have no idea how time flows in the world inside the book. It might easily be a few days. That way, my body might meet with an accident since it lacks protection. I'm in unfamiliar territory as well. When the time comes, I might rescue Edwina, but I would find myself gone. That would be fun. Klein quickly rejected the idea of entering as a spirit body. He didn't trust most of the people on the Golden Dream, and he also felt wary of the strongest hunter, Anderson. His attempt to divine if it was dangerous to enter the book to rescue Edwina was met with failure. Klein thought deeply for a moment before returning to the real world. Then, he unhurriedly brought back Grozel's travels and removed the traces of the ritual. Looking out the window at the impending dusk, he walked to the captain's cabin's door, unlocked the door, and opened it. Gourmet Brew Walls, singer Orpheus, and company were all outside. None of them had left. There were even sailors who peeked their heads out from the staircase. Any clues? Brew Walls blurted out his question, but he didn't hear his voice because everyone at the door was asking the same question. Klein swept his gaze and nodded. Instantly, he heard sighs of relief, then he saw all kinds of happy and excited expressions. If I were to vanish one day, who would act like that? Klein focused his thoughts and said to Danitz, I need an assistant. With that said, he turned to walk to the desk. All right. Danitz hurriedly followed and familiarly locked the door. Is there anything you need of me? He hurriedly asked. He looked as though he could already see his captain being rescued through his hard work. Klein stood by the desk and solemnly said, What happens next will be very dangerous. Very dangerous? Danitz instinctively gritted his teeth. You might vanish or even die immediately. Klein told him the worst possible outcome. Seeing how serious the madman, Gehrman Sparrow, was, Danitz instantly understood the gravity of the situation. His heart sank as he subconsciously became frantic. What does this have to do with rescuing Captain? It's directly related, Klein answered succinctly. Danitz's expression twisted as he fell silent for 2 seconds. What will happen if nothing is done? Your captain might be left there forever, or she might die in the next second, Klein said truthfully. Danitz turned agape as he closed his mouth in silence. His eyes turned adrift for a few seconds before they focused back on Gehrman Sparrow's face. Gritting his teeth, he said, Let's begin. Dog's hit, he softly cursed himself. Klein picked up the pen and paper on the table, scribbled a note, and folded it into a square before handing it to Danitz. Put it into your pocket. Read it after you enter. Enter? Danitz asked, puzzled and clueless. As he spoke, he automatically took the paper slip and stuffed it into his trouser pocket. Klein didn't reply as he pointed at Grozel's travels. Smear some of your blood on the book's cover. This. As Danitz made a vague guess, he picked up the bronze dagger beside him and nodded heavily. All right. Chapter 694, Burn upon Chanting. Danitz held the bronze dagger and sliced across the back of his left palm, but his hesitation prevented him from using much strength. He looked up and forced a smile. Although I've been injured many times, pain still leaves me afraid. Get to the point, Klein replied coldly. Danitz gave a hollow laugh. I'm just a little scared of pain. Just as he said that, he exerted strength with his right hand, slicing open a wound on the back of his hand with the bronze knife. The words he had said was apparently to divert his attention so that he could reconcile with the idea of pain. Blood quickly seeped out as Danitz immediately put down the dagger. He dabbed some blood on his right finger and smeared it across the dark brown cover of Grozel's Travels. After finishing that, he held his breath, waiting for a change. Suddenly, he saw a snowflake the size of a goose feather. Strong winds howled by his ears, and immediately, a biting chill wildly drilled into his body. Although Danitz was mentally prepared, he was still alarmed. He instinctively looked around to confirm where he was. He realized that at some point in time he had left the captain's cabin of the Golden Dream. He found himself in a land of frost wrecked by a blizzard. Due to the extreme environment, he couldn't see into the distance at all. He couldn't even tell if he was on a mountain or on a flat plain. I've really entered a strange world. Captain is here too? Danitz held up his hand to block his face, afraid that the snow would get into his eyes. He calmed himself down and recalled Gehrman Sparrow's instructions. From his pocket, he hurriedly took out a piece of paper that had been folded into a square, and he carefully unfolded it. While doing this, he was especially afraid of any accidents that could lead to the paper tearing or being blown away. That would make him lose all hope, but thankfully, none of that happened. He saw the contents written by Gehrman Sparrow. Recite the following honorific name in Hermes, but preferably in ancient Hermes, the fool that doesn't belong to this era. The mysterious ruler above the gray fog. The king of yellow and black who wields good luck. Burn this upon Chanting. This is a secret existence at the level of a deity. Due to Vice Admiral Iceberg Edwina's strict education, Danitz wasn't illiterate when it came to mysticism. He even had quite a good foundation. Looking at the piece of paper in his hand, he subconsciously drew a gasp, sucking in the cold wind and ice-cold snowflakes that left a biting cold. He immediately coughed as his expression turned twisted. He was now able to confirm one of his past theories. Gehrman Sparrow really did belong to a powerful and very secretive organization. And the organization consecrates an existence known as the Fool, a godlike existence. Indeed, such a powerful and crazy fellow can't appear out of nowhere. They don't just sprout out of the ground. Danitz tugged at his collar and tightened his clothes. Looking at the piece of paper fluttering in the wind, he wore a clear look of hesitation. He knew very well how dangerous it was to recite the name of an unknown secret existence whose intentions were unknown. It could lead to an outcome more terrifying than death. Captain is also trapped here. Furthermore, there's no way of leaving. Danitz clasped his hands and placed them before his mouth. He suddenly threw out his hands and used ancient Hermes to recite the Fool's honorific name. On the Golden Dream, in the captain's cabin. With his own eyes, Klein witnessed Danitz turn illusory without any reason before disappearing. There was no longer any question about how entry into Grozel's travels could be achieved. After patiently waiting for a moment, he heard a series of illusory pleas, and it clearly came from a man. Phew, from the looks of it, Grozel's travels is unable to block out the gray fog. The world inside the book is still connected to that mysterious space. This way, even if I were to enter, I wouldn't be entirely cornered or lack any trump cards. Klein didn't hide his sigh of relief. To confirm it, he took 4 steps counterclockwise while chanting the incantation. After arriving above the gray fog, he saw the brilliance representing Danitz rippling outwards beside the Fool's high-back chair. The body and soul enter together. The world inside the book is very stable. There's no way to shatter it just by pulling the spirit body. Indeed, if it's possible, the divination from before would have received the corresponding revelation. Using the sea god scepter is too dangerous. Bestowing Danitz directly will only speed up his death. Klein half-closed his eyes as he emanated his spirituality. After taking everything in for a moment, he arrived at many conclusions. He didn't delay and returned to the real world immediately. Holding the bronze dagger, he wiped away Danitz's blood on it with a piece of paper. After folding a piece of paper and putting it into his pocket, he began to consider his next move. From the looks of it, smearing blood allows direct entry. This way, I don't have to worry about my body suffering any accidents. Furthermore, I can very quickly resolve the problem. But similarly, I can't be careless. I have to be careful of any other dangers. If there's anyone on this ship that might be problematic, they might be able to sneak into the captain's cabin after I enter Grozel's travels, sacrifice this book to the true creator, primordial demoness, or hidden sage. I'll be in trouble then. I'll definitely suffer something worse than death. The Golden Dream sailors mostly seem to be infatuated with Vice Admiral Iceberg. The fact that Anderson's superficial provocation was effective enough proves this. Therefore, telling them that this involves Vice Admiral Iceberg's life and getting them to watch each other so that no one enters, that will put me at ease. The problem lies with Anderson. He's the strongest hunter. He's stronger than any of the Beyonders on board this ship. Furthermore, he's good at ambushes and infiltration. There's a small possibility that he can avoid the monitoring of others and secretly sneak into the captain's cabin. His background is still too dubious, and I have no way to really trust him. I have to think of a way to get him to enter Grozel's travels with me. Amidst his thoughts, Klein flipped through the ancient book covered in yellowish-brown goatskin. He discovered that there wasn't any new content, and the story lacked traces of Danitz's existence. This is to say that one needs to successfully survive and meet up with the lead's team before they will be considered a true part of the story. That will make more pages appear. Klein made a preliminary guess as he walked to the door again and opened it. Did it succeed? Flowery Bow Tie Jotson and Company asked. Klein shook his head and said calmly, next up will be a long ritual. No one is to enter and disrupt it, otherwise, it will lead to Edwina Edwards's disappearance forever or even her death. After informing them of the main point, he looked around and directly said, I suspect that one of you here might have problems. Everyone is to watch each other. Gourmet Brew Walls instinctively wanted to retort out of habit when he suddenly saw the captain's cabin was empty. Danitz, who had just entered, was gone. Recalling the captain's disappearance, and confirming that Gehrman Sparrow was about to attempt to save her after finding the cause of the problem, he nodded and said, I'll be in charge of this matter. And they will also monitor me. Klein didn't harp on the topic. He then turned to look at Anderson Hood, who was leaning against a wall. Come in. Anderson curled the right side of his mouth as he'd sked. People not in the know might think I'm your subordinate. Your attitude is basically a role model for provokers. Despite his grumbling, he straightened his back and opened his stride before entering the captain's cabin. After closing the door and locking it, Klein turned to face Anderson. Are you interested in participating in a rare adventure? You might be able to fulfill the achievement of hunting a dragon. According to his observations over the past few days, he believed that Anderson Hood was a curious and adventurous hunter. He enjoyed learning about new things and experiencing novel forms of excitement. Anderson stared at Gehrman Sparrow's face and sized him up seriously before smiling. I'm not interested. He firmly shook his head. Following that, he chuckled before Klein spoke again. I smell danger. A highly conceited, crazy, and powerful adventurer is actually inviting me to adventure together. What does this imply? It means that it's extremely troublesome and dangerous. I thought you would be interested. This is different from how you usually act. You really can rein yourself in and let go of yourself. I'll try another threat. If it doesn't work, I'll throw this fellow on a deserted island and let the Golden Dream sail off. We'll pick him up later. As a hunter, survival on a deserted island shouldn't be difficult for him. Klein quickly made up his mind as his gaze immediately turned cold. He looked at Anderson and said, I will not permit having latent risks around myself. Anderson was stunned for a second before he quickly smiled. It was just a joke. I'm very interested in the title of Dragon Hunter. You changed your mind way too quickly. If you had insisted a little longer, you could have enjoyed the feeling of being abandoned. Klein nodded, walked back to the desk, and said to Anderson Hood, who had followed behind him, smear your blood on this book's cover. There's no need for too much. Smear it? Anderson scrutinized Grozel's travels out of curiosity before surveying the area. Edwina's disappearance is related to it? Same for that failure of a hunter's disappearance? Ah, right. Blazing Danitz. I nearly forgot his name. Thankfully, his bounty is a bit higher than before. The corner of Klein's mouth twitched as he replied frankly, that's right. Interesting. Anderson glanced at the desk, picked up the bronze dagger, and indifferently sliced open a bleeding gash in his hand. Right on the heels of that, he carefully put down the dagger and smeared the blood on the dark brown cover of Grozel's Travels. After a few seconds of observation, just as Anderson was about to pick up the bronze dagger and wipe off the remnant blood on it, his vision was suddenly blanketed by a blizzard. Seeing Anderson disappear just like Danitz, Klein picked up another piece of paper and wiped away the blood on the dagger before folding it and putting it into his pocket. He wasn't sure if the trio would appear at the same location after entering the world inside the book. Therefore, he made preparations by having materials needed for dowsing rod seeking. After doing all of this, Klein held that dagger and streaked it across the back of his hand. His facial muscles twitched as he looked diagonally downwards. Only after a few seconds did he exert strength. His body shook slightly as his head turned to the side. The corners of his mouth couldn't help but open. When the blood flowed out, Klein, who was still holding the dagger, grabbed his cane and quickly smeared the red liquid over the ancient book's cover. After a short delay, Klein found himself amidst a white land of snow. Chapter 695, stark contrast gales with icy fragments and goose feather-sized snowflakes blasted at Klein's face repeatedly. As he surveyed his surroundings, he couldn't help but tense up. He bent over slightly as he trembled. How cold! He nearly cursed out as he confirmed that he was in a land of ice and snow which had extremely low visibility. He originally imagined that the moist coldness of Backlund's winter was terrifying, but he now knew that absolute low temperatures and strong winds that were as sharp as blades were a deadly combination. Even though he had worn an additional sweater ahead of time, and his coat was thick and long, he still couldn't withstand the chill. He didn't wear sun brooch because the heat generated was psychological. It could be used to resist the influence of the intense chill for a short period of time, preventing his body from turning numb. But faced with an everlasting icy environment, it was equivalent to suicide. Heat at the psychological level made one's pores open up as though one was in summer. It would peel off the final layer of defense against low temperatures, and it would even proactively welcome it. Therefore, Klein threw the mystical item above the gray fog. He planned on using it only on certain special occasions. He couldn't afford to delay while in such harsh environments. After a preliminary observation of his surroundings, he immediately burned the blood on the bronze dagger and stuffed it into his pocket. Following that, Klein took out the adventurer's harmonica and blew into it. Amidst the howling winds, he failed to discover the appearance of Miss Messenger, Tinker Rionette, through the spirit vision he activated. Indeed, this place isn't connected to the spirit world. Or it should be said that this place has a unique spirit world for itself. From the looks of it, praying to see God would be useless. Only charms that point to the mysterious space above the gray fog would tear through the barrier. Here comes the problem. As a believer of the God of knowledge and wisdom, Edwina knows the true God's honorific name. Why didn't she seek his help? Or did she try to no avail? Yes. Not every deity will personally reply to their believers. Many a time, they seem to provide feedback based on certain laws. You probably can't find a second secret existence like me who takes on jobs like myself. Klein gave a self-deprecating laugh and made a preliminary judgment. He then put away his harmonica, took out the paper slip with Danitz's blood, and he wrapped it at the end of his cane. Danitz's location. Klein softly said as he began using dowsing rod seeking. Then, according to the outcome, he traversed across the thick snow, and he quickly tore through the frosty winds under the gloomy sky. From time to time, he would carry out a divination and adjust his bearings. After all, Danitz wouldn't wait in his original spot, as he would end up as an ice sculpture by doing so. About 10 minutes later, Klein discovered a scarlet flame. Phew. He exhaled before taking a few steps forward to identify his target. It was indeed Danitz. This famous pirate wore rather thin clothes. He wrapped his arms around himself as he walked forward with a lost expression. However, he didn't seem to be that cold. This was because scarlet fire ravens were circling around him. They were boiling the snow and blocking out the winds, bringing about a spring-like warmth. In such times, Klein especially admired a pyromaniac. Although a magician had the same ability to summon flames, it was an offensive ability that couldn't be maintained. It could only be used for a split moment. To rely on it to warm himself, he needed to constantly cast it, tiring himself out quickly. As for flame controlling, it depended on existing flames or ignitable materials. Both of them were extremely lacking in this world of ice. As he saw the fire ravens soaring into the air, Klein sped up his pace and approached. Danitz jumped in fright when he sensed someone approaching. When he saw who the newcomer was, he immediately heaved a sigh of relief. Then, with an odd expression, he forced a smile. There's no stars to be seen here. Getting lost is inevitable. Klein ignored what he said as he directly asked, "Have you burned it?" "I did." Danitz hurriedly nodded, his entire being effusing with indescribable fear. Klein observed Danitz for a few seconds and, after confirming that he wasn't lying, produced the polite smile of Gehrman Sparrow. "Remember, chanting his honorific name makes you his believer. Danitz's expression twisted as he forced a smile which looked worse than crying. I don't want to change my faith. I have no intention of believing in an unknown existence of dubious origins. He inwardly roared crazily but didn't say a word. He suspected that any retort he makes would lead to him being buried in the snow by the madman. Klein wore a smile that had hints of madness. He added with a calm tone, remember, keep it a secret. Once divulged, you and your captain will both die. What has this got to do with Captain? Danitz blurted out. Klein maintained his previous expression as he smiled at Danitz. Guess? Danitz gaped his mouth. With the reason known, all he could do was give a hollow chuckle. Do I look like someone who can't keep secrets? Klein nodded. As he took out the paper slip with Anderson's blood, he chuckled and said to Danitz, believe in him. Serve him. Perhaps one day, you will become a blessed like me. When the time comes, your name will spread across the 5 seas. You will be in no way inferior to a pirate admiral. As he spoke, he planned on adding a gesture as the fool's believer, but sadly, he realized that he didn't have such a gesture. All he could do was console himself. A secret organization needs to be secret. Doing all these kinds of superficial actions is meaningless. Mr. Hanged Man was right. No way inferior to a pirate admiral. Danitz's eyes suddenly lit up. Since I've already chanted the honorific name of this secret existence, there's really no way to avoid it from a mysticism point of view. I might as well take this opportunity. He instantly had many thoughts, having even named his future child. If it wasn't for Gehrman Sparrow's persona, I would have directly said that you would have the reputation and strength that matches Vice Admiral Iceberg when the time comes. Of course, whether she likes you will be a whole other matter. According to my observations, you stand little chance. The partner Edwina wishes to have is someone who can study and improve alongside her, someone who can discuss all kinds of knowledge. Klein mumbled as he used dowsing rod seeking again. Anderson Hood's location. He came in too. Danitz was first taken aback before he asked in surprise. Klein finished chanting the statement, released his cane, and determined the direction in which it fell. He then nodded and said, I'm worried if he stays outside. So you're also wary of Anderson Hood? Danitz couldn't hide his smile as he echoed, that's right. He's the kind of person who smiles on the surface but will stab you in the back once you turn around. His reputation in the Fog Sea is terrible. There are no pirates that like him. He even deliberately tried to sully you, making us be wary of you, to view you with animosity. If pirates were to like him, it would only mean that his title as strongest hunter isn't substantial. I heard Anderson's provocations. Klein didn't reply. He picked up his cane and proceeded through the blizzard. Danitz followed closely behind, using fire ravens to scatter the snow and block out the cold, so that they too didn't need to freeze. Not bad. Quite sensible. At that moment, Klein once again experienced the benefits of having a servant, to have someone hold an umbrella during a rainy day, and someone to provide warmth in a blizzard. In the white vastness, the two appeared like black dots, trudging through the snow. They proceeded forward for nearly 20 minutes before arriving at the location where the dowsing pointed to. He isn't here. Danitz surveyed the area and failed to find any traces of Anderson Hood. He didn't have any doubts about Gehrman Sparrow's dowsing rod seeking, because he was the last person to be found with it. Klein frowned as he activated his spirit vision and enhanced his spiritual perception. Suddenly, he sensed something. He prodded forward with his cane, causing the snow in front of him to collapse. The collapse revealed a cave. Inside it were dark rocks that were reflecting the light from a fire. Klein crouched down. In his vision, he discovered that the cave extended into a narrow passage. And at the end of the passage was a bunch of glowing red rocks. Strange underground plants were slowly burning as Anderson Hood sat beside it. He was leisurely roasting an animal that resembled a rabbit. The fragrance of the fats and the warmth it brought were emanating out, drilling into Klein's and Danitz's noses. You guys are finally here? Want to give it a try? There's actually a strange rabbit around here that can live in such ice and snow. Anderson bent down, looking towards the entrance as though he was greeting companions on a camping trip with him. Although he didn't say anything provocative, I really wished to beat him up. Klein entered the cave with a stoic expression. He came close to the fire and experienced the long-awaited bliss. Danitz followed in tow. He looked at the fire which was roasting a rabbit and then at the fire ravens beside him before silently dispelling them. How did you find this cave? Danitz asked in disgruntlement, unwilling to admit his inferiority, but his body betrayed him by leaning closer to the fire. Anderson turned the rabbit which was impaled with his pitch-black sword, and he shot Danitz a glance. First lesson of being a hunter. Observe your surroundings. Be familiar with your surroundings. Make use of your surroundings. Danitz's expression immediately froze. Anderson looked at Gehrman Sparrow and chuckled. It's a cave I blasted open. How is it? It's not bad, right? I controlled my strength perfectly. As he spoke, he took a whiff of the air and said, "How fragrant. The roasting seems to be done. Do you want to give it a try? Although I didn't bring any spices, there's rock salt here. It will just be a little astringent. Are you sure you can eat this? If it's a beyonder creature, you might lose control with just one bite," Danitz said with a tsk. Anderson glanced at him. Second lesson of being a hunter. Distinguish what can and cannot be eaten in the wilderness. He carefully reached out his hand, pulled off a leg, and stuffed it into his mouth as he ate it with relish. Klein was just about to say something when he suddenly felt a wanton aura approach from afar. The suppressive feeling that came from a high-leveled creature appeared extremely real. It made Danitz tremble uncontrollably. The aura swept across them without noticing the strangeness of the cave beneath it. It then quickly departed. King of the North. The title flashed across Klein's mind. Chapter 696, Giant Guardian. As the tyrannical aura flew past, high in the sky, Anderson's chewing came to a sudden halt. It was only when the entity was a distance away did he swallow the remaining rabbit meat. He looked up at Gehrman Sparrow. That was the dragon you were talking about? Klein nodded slightly, confirming Anderson's guess. The corners of Anderson's mouth slowly curled up, revealing an expression as though he was at a loss on whether to laugh or cry. I thought you were talking about a mature or adolescent dragon. The one that just flew past. I probably won't be able to become a dragon hunter. Dragon feces perhaps. The tyrannical feeling that the King of the North exudes is indeed a little terrifying. Compared to the pieced-together monster which made hair grow without restraint on the future, it's a lot stronger. Perhaps, it's a sequence 4, at the level of a demigod. Klein calmly made a judgment without revealing any hints of panic or horror. He clearly remembered that Grozel's travels had clearly indicated that the female pirate had managed to succeed in escaping from the King of the North's attack before meeting up with the team led by the main lead, Grozel. And Edwina Edwards clearly wasn't a demigod. She was a sequence 5 of the reader pathway. Furthermore, as she was suddenly swallowed by the book, certain mystical items and sealed artifacts that she didn't permanently keep on her person were left in the captain's cabin. The tools she had that were useful to her were probably limited to 1 or 2. Under such a situation, she was able to defend against the King of the North and survive. Having just advanced, and having adjusted his inventory, Klein believed that it wouldn't faze him too much. Furthermore, he was still connected to the gray fog. He could use the sea god scepter to produce a response. This was also why Klein dared to enter directly after confirming that Danitz was in an ordinary state during his prayer. Yes, the King of the North doesn't seem like a demigod from a normal pathway. According to Vice Admiral Iceberg, it's a rampager who gathers frost-related beyonder characteristics, and it can match a demigod in certain domains but would have flaws in other aspects. Edwina, Anderson, and me, along with the beyonders of the main lead's team, we wouldn't be helpless. If all else fails, I can still use the sea god scepter. I don't believe that this book can defend against items above the gray fog. If it could, it would have shown it long ago. Standing beside the fire, Klein looked down at Anderson and grinned. Are you afraid? Anderson was taken aback as he immediately beamed. Not at all. You seem to be very confident. After saying that, he looked at Danitz, who was still trembling and trying hard to compose himself, before Tsking. Do you know what's the most important thing for a man? Danitz had just taken a deep breath. He was stunned by what he heard as he held his right index finger and middle finger together, pointing to his crotch with uncertainty. Anderson blinked before he roared with laughter. Bastard, you really are a crude pirate. I wanted to say something, but... I can't remember it. Oh right, I wanted to say courage. Courage is the most important thing for a man. Look at you. The dragon hasn't even attacked, and you're almost hugging your head and begging for mercy. Danitz's face instantly flushed red as he glared at Anderson. You weren't acting like this back at Toskarter. Klein couldn't help but lampoon. Danitz was just about to make it clear that he was only influenced by the high-level creature when he suddenly recalled what was just said. His expression was immediately restored to normal as he casually replied, I can't compare with dragon feces at all. Anderson's smile froze as he coughed lightly. As though nothing had happened, he yanked off a rabbit's leg and handed it over to Gehrman Sparrow. Want a bite? Klein remained silent for a few seconds before he slowly shook his head. This is a strange world. Before confirming that there aren't any problems, it's best not to eat anything here. Perhaps it might be a piece of rabbit meat that will make you stay here forever. Anderson moved the roasted rabbit's leg to his nose before slowly putting it down. Following that, his face collapsed. Why didn't you say so earlier? Klein calmly replied, I just thought of this problem. Anderson's expression turned twisted as he lowered his head. He quickly bit down on his roasted rabbit leg. Aren't you afraid that something really bad will happen? The strongest hunter's actions alarmed Danitz. Anderson laughed helplessly. I've already eaten one earlier. I've already digested it by now. Since there's no way of turning back, I might as well focus on enjoying it. Klein and Danitz were momentarily at a loss for words. After Anderson finished gnawing on the rabbit's leg, he deliberated and asked, Are you really not eating? We have no idea how much time we'll be spending here. If we really do starve, how are we supposed to fight the dragon? Klein didn't reply. He took out his golden pocket watch and opened it. It's 6:10 in the evening outside. We'll eat a little after 4 to 6 hours if nothing happens to you. Anderson turned agape, speechless. Klein ignored him and turned to say to Danitz, 15 minutes break. We'll search for your captain after that. As he said that, he had already taken out the pearl earring belonging to Vice Admiral Iceberg Edwina Edwards. All right. Danitz suddenly felt pumped with his blood boiling, completely forgetting the cold outside. But after about 8 seconds, he huddled close to the fire again. Around 7 in the evening in the outside world, Klein pressed down on his hat and held his cane. Together with Danitz and Anderson, he followed the revelation provided by his divination and found their way to a mountain. After circling the boulders which were encased in thick layers of ice, they saw a dark mountain cave. Standing by the entrance was a woman holding an ancient bow. The woman had a head of soft, lustrous black hair which she had simply tied into a pigtail. Her facial features were soft, making her look different from any national of the northern continent. She wore a brown ancient-styled hunter's coat and trousers. She acutely cast her gaze over. Upon seeing her slightly sharp ears, Klein immediately guessed her identity from matching her to the content in Grozel's travels. She was the female elf who got to know the giant, Grozel, at the very beginning. Her name was unknown. Compared to Earth, people from the northern continent look more Caucasian. But this elf has more of an oriental charm. Klein quickly concluded this particular trait. An elf. She's identical to the elves drawn in the ancient church drawings. Anderson suddenly became excited. I have to negotiate with her to get her to be my model so that I can draw a few portraits of her. By the side, Danitz scoffed. He mocked in a succinct manner, boorish. Clearly, he hadn't forgotten Anderson's previous mockery. Do you only know of that kind of drawing? Anderson shot a glance at him, sped up, and walked towards the female elf. Just as he approached, the female elf didn't hesitate to raise her bow. The arrow strung on it shimmered with silver lightning. Wait! Anderson immediately raised his hands. It's useless. The elves mostly belong to the storm pathway. They are prone to being irascible and rash. Klein secretly activated his spirit body threads, planning to achieve initial control over the elf in order to let her listen calmly. At this moment, Anderson saw a blur before seeing two thick, huge, muscular grayish-blue legs. Embedded in the snow was a huge, terrifying sword. Anderson was horrified to realize that his height only reached the leg's knees. He instinctively followed the sword and looked up, bit by bit. With his head almost completely facing upwards, he finally saw the giant who was nearly 4 meters tall. The giant's skin was grayish-blue. His abdomen and waist was covered in a thick furry beast hide, leaving him naked everywhere else. Even his legs lacked protection. He pounded on the sword, which was wider than a human door, and using his trademark single vertical eye to look at Anderson, Klein, and Danitz, he asked with a booming voice, "Who are you? Why are you here in the Grozel camp?" Klein was just about to reply when a familiar figure suddenly walked out from the dark mountain cave. Danitz's eyes were instantly filled with ecstasy. Dressed in a complicated shirt and dark-colored trousers, Edwina swept her gaze across the trio. Her usually cold expression revealed a rather flabbergasted look, as though she hadn't expected to see Gehrman Sparrow and Anderson Hood here. She quickly composed herself and looked up at the giant. "Grozel, they are my companions." Grozel widened his huge mouth into a grin and asked in delight, "Are you also here to help deal with Ulyssin?" Ulyssin? Klein was momentarily left at a loss for an answer. At that moment, he saw Edwina, who was standing in the giant's shadow, give him a look. She wanted him to give an affirmative answer. "Ulyssin is the king of the north?" Klein replied in thought, "Yes." "Ha, then we are friends." Grozel looked down at the trio and laughed. As he spoke, Anderson silently retreated back to Gehrman Sparrow's side as he said under his breath, "This is the first time I'm meeting a living giant. There's no way of hitting his vital spots. He's just too tall. You can hit his legs." Klein lampooned and calmly replied, "A huge target makes it easy to strike them." "That's right." Anderson agreed. At that moment, Edwina walked over and introduced the three of them. "This is the leader of the camp, Giant Guardian Grozel. This is the elvish songster, Ciadas." Elvish songster? Ocean songster? Klein suddenly felt that there was hope for Mr. Hanged Man's potion formula. Edwina turned halfway around and said to Grozel and Ciadas, "They are my companions. The strongest adventurer, Gehrman Sparrow, treasure hunter, Anderson Hood, and renowned sailor, Danitz. I always thought Vice Admiral Iceberg was the serious type who never lied. Renowned sailor. Ha, in a certain way, that's true." Klein took off his hat and gave a serious bow. Anderson followed suit in a rather casual and perfunctory manner. Reeling in his delight that his captain had introduced him as a companion instead of a subordinate, Danitz was slower than the others as he acted in a fluster. Grozel laughed. "Come on in. We will be fighting that evil dragon, Ulyssin, at any moment now." How warm and amiable. But be it the church's canon or the myths of the City of Silver, giants are extremely violent creatures who have a strong desire for destruction. Yes, anything is possible in a book. It all depends on whether the author can make everything flow nicely. Klein nodded slightly as he followed Grozel into the spacious cave. When Edwina saw this, she approached the trio without showing any signs of abnormal behavior. As though she was leading the way, she whispered, "The history they speak of is a little odd. Same for their language. Regardless of the language they speak, all of us can understand it." Chapter 697, Story's Progress. Everyone can understand each other regardless of the language used? Klein skipped over Edwina's first sentence and focused his attention on the second sentence that didn't seem too problematic. Although this was the book world created by Grozel's travels, everything was possible, but there were certain details that still revealed problems. To Klein, he wasn't too caught up with how that they could understand each other, but the kind of method that resulted in the comprehension. This world incorporates something akin to the rule of language comprehension, or does it have a conscious residing high above everyone else, helping in the real-time translation work, just like what I do at the tarot gatherings? If it were the former, targets who don't understand Jotun will only hear an unfamiliar language, but they would understand the meaning. If it were the latter, it will be them hearing a language they're familiar with. As he knew many ancient and supernatural languages, Klein was unable to figure out the situation immediately. He slowed down his footsteps and walked alongside Danitz. He asked while suppressing his voice, "Can you tell what language Grozel was using when he was speaking?" Danitz was taken aback for a second. He recalled and said, "It's a language which sounds a little familiar yet unfamiliar, but I was able to understand everything." The supernatural languages he knew were ancient Hermes, followed by Elvish. He was only a beginner in Jotun. Yes, it's something like the rule of language comprehension. It's comprehension at the level of the mind. This means that the entire book world's fundamental rules can be different from the outside world. It's a setting that it comes with, but the changes don't seem capable of exceeding certain limits. This point remains suspect and requires verification. After all, I can't eliminate the existence of someone like the Fool, someone who completely interprets the communication via the mind. Edwina is indeed sharp and good at observing. The problem she discovered leads straight to this book world's essence. Amidst his thoughts, Klein unhurriedly entered the huge, dark cave. As for the history described by the members of the main lead's team, he wasn't the least bit surprised. He even looked forward to hearing the details. Klein long knew that the various churches and the northern continent's countries had consciously attempted to destroy or conceal information, to hide the true history of the fourth epoch, third epoch, and even the second epoch. What people knew as common knowledge actually differed from the people who used to live in those eras. This was also one of the reasons why Klein took on the risk to enter the book world. Inside the spacious and windy cave, a bonfire scattered its light and heat on 3 humanoid figures. One of them was a middle-aged man in an extremely Spartan white robe. He had wrinkles but didn't appear old. He had his back to the fire as he faced the stone wall with his eyes closed, focused on his prayers. He had short brown hair, and his shoulders, arms, calves, and feet were exposed, revealing all kinds of old scars. Beside him was a lad using a stone for a pillow. He donned a black, heavy full-body armor. By his hand was an erected black sword that emitted a cold shimmering light. His facial features were rather deep, giving him clear lone traits. Sitting opposite the two was a man in his 30s who was dressed strangely. He gave people a sense of unease. He wore a sharp and hard black hat, and his coat's buttons were mismatched. It was messy and chaotic, highly asymmetric and unharmonious. In addition, the tips of his leather boots curled up high, making him look like a circus clown. This man had quite a handsome face. He had flaxen-colored hair, deep brown eyes, a high nose, and thin lips. Even though he sat there, he gave off an arrogant feeling. Edwina pointed at him and said, "Solomon Empire's Viscount Mobit Zoroast, a gentleman who can take away the ideals and dreams of others. You don't have to mince your words." "Hello there, I'm a Sequence 5 Dream Stealer of the Marauder Pathway," Mobit said with a chuckle. He acted nothing like the arrogance he seemed to exude. "A member of the Zoroast family. The angel parasitizing Leonard's body is from this family. Perhaps they know each other?" "Heh, I now know the name of Sequence 4 and 5 of the Marauder Pathway, but I don't even know the corresponding Sequence 6 and 7. Many thoughts flashed through Klein's mind as he maintained his stoic look. At that moment, Anderson warmly greeted him with a smile and asked as though they were pals, "To be frank, this is the first time I'm hearing of Dream Stealer. I only know of Marauder and Swindler. There are 2 sequences in the middle I'm not aware of. Are the Beyonders of this pathway already so scarce?" Doesn't Edwina know? Sequence 7 Cryptologist and Sequence 6 Fire Bandit. Let me do the introductions. Mobit warmly pointed to the praying man whose back was facing everyone. The pious ascetic, Snowman. He believes in the Lord that created everything, the omnipotent and omniscient God. Don't mind him. He's completely sealed himself in his beliefs. But in combat, he's a very reliable companion. Snowman, you should say something at the very least. Mobit, who didn't receive a response, stroked his chin with a rueful smile. This is the treatment I often receive. You might find it hard to imagine that I was an arrogant, reserved, and refined nobleman. But time has changed everything. That happens when your companion is a giant who only knows how to chuckle foolishly and shout slogans. When he said this, Grozel, who was sitting on a rock, smiled in a simple and good-natured manner. He raised his hand to scratch the back of his head as his single vertical eye didn't show the ferocity and cruelness that giants were strongly rumored to have. Mobit shook his head and pointed at the ascetic, Snowman. As for him, he might not speak a single word for years or even a decade. Ciatas is a very violent woman. As long as there are any emotional stirrings in her, she'll beat me up. Sigh, I'm as afraid of her now as I was infatuated over her back then. Therefore, I can only make conversation and speak to them, otherwise, I'll definitely go mad. Thankfully, Frunzier came later. He's quite the conversationalist. Hey, Frunzier, wake up. We have new companions. The sleeping black-armored knight slowly woke up as he looked at Klein and company. Suddenly, there was the sound of metal striking each other as he stood up. Staring at Klein, he said, Loanese? Yes, Klein nodded frankly. He discovered that this lone soldier who had gone missing for 165 years didn't look old. He had black hair and sharp, blue eyes. He made one submit to him unknowingly. Frunzier appeared adrift for a moment as he quickly composed himself. Do you know of Backlund's Edward family? Backlund has many Edwards, Klein replied simply. The Edward family that lives at 18 Delahar Street in Northwest Borough, Frunzier pressed anxiously. Klein shook his head. Northwest Borough no longer exists. Northwest Borough no longer exists, Frunzier repeated those words as his voice grew softer. He fell silent for a few seconds before exhaling. I've no idea how many years have passed outside, but it should have been quite a while. Edwina told me the actual year, but I don't remember the year I entered. I was sleeping most of the time, and time here seems to be frozen. Mobit Zorost chuckled upon hearing that. That's because you have bad luck. Back when we were passing through cities and villages, everything was perfect. He looked at Klein, Anderson, and Danitz. Back then, we lived in places with humans, with intelligent races. We got married again and again, seeing our wives turn old, grow weak, and die. Before a new member joins, we would forget our goals. We would lead ordinary but happy and relaxed lives for decades or centuries. The only con is that we aren't able to bear our own children. Later, Frunzier came. We entered this region blanketed by ice and snow. We hunted many monsters, but gradually, we began to fall into a slumber. We were seldom awake until we met Edwina. This means that time in the book world flows normally. The story's progress is maintained by a certain power that influences the main lead's party. Before new members join and before the book's pages flip, they'll stop and stay at a certain node, doing other things. This is similar to the intertranslation of languages at the mind level. Conversely, does this also mean that towns and villages in the book world also develop normally? Yes, I have to quickly find King of the North Ulyssan, otherwise, with the passage of time, we might also experience that influence and fall into a slumber or forget the main quest. We'll stay here for a long period of time until a new member is swallowed into the book and finds us. Klein fell silent for a few seconds. Just as he was about to say something, Edwina said, There's no need to worry about that problem. We will soon encounter the King of the North. Why? Anderson and Mobit asked in unison. Edwina surveyed the area and said, "Before I entered, the stuck pages in the book only had a few more pages. And now, with you entering and finding the camp, there definitely can't be many pages left. The story is about to come to an end." Mobit nodded indiscernibly in agreement with Edwina's judgment. Anderson softly mumbled terms such as stuck. Edwina then introduced Klein, Anderson, and Danitz as she made an example of herself and sat down beside the bonfire. Klein took off his hat and held it with his cane. He slowly sat down and looked at Mobit Zoroast, who was inclined to chat. "Have you heard of the Tudor Empire and the Trunsoist Empire?" He didn't beat around the bush and asked directly. That was Gehrman Sparrow's persona. "No." Mobit shook his head. "Edwina has already asked me. In my era, the Tudors and Trunsoists were just like my Zoroast family. We're aristocratic families of the Solomon Empire and were loyal subjects of the Black Emperor. So the Trunsoist and Tudor families were traitors of the Solomon Empire." Klein thought and said, "Apart from you, what other aristocratic families did the Solomon Empire have?" "Many." Mobit smiled as he looked at Frunzier. "Augustus, Abraham, Zeradol, etc. In my era, the Church of the Evernight Goddesses Archenemies were the Church of the God of Combat and the Southern Continent's Egger's family. The churches of the Lord of Storms, Eternal Blazing Sun, and the God of Knowledge and Wisdom were all at odds with each other, all of them hoping to gain the support of the Solomon Empire." He paused for 2 seconds as his expression gradually turned solemn. "Back then, deities walked the land, and not in the astral world." Chapter 698, Fifth King of Angels. Deities walked the land, and not in the astral world. In the early Fourth Epoch, during the era of the Solomon Empire, there was no distinguishing between the worlds of myth and reality. Deities directly walked the land without the need for a descent. This is somewhat similar to the Second Epoch as written in the City of Silver's books. The Giant King's court and other locations are separated by a door in the real world. They just needed to pass through it and return the same way. Mortals and deities mixed together in the chaos and darkness. Also, the astral world really does correspond to deities. After hearing Viscount Mobit Zoroast's description, Klein instantly began connecting the dots. He subconsciously swept a glance at Grosel, as this giant was very likely someone who had experienced the history of the Second Epoch. Grosel picked up a cup larger than a wooden bucket and gulped down some melted snow as he laughed. "Mobit, what's there to be surprised about? Why are you so solemn?" "I've no idea why I became so solemn either." Bit by bit, Mobit Zoroast revealed a smile. It might be something very normal for us, but in their eyes, it's terrifying and unbelievable. I have to use a suitable expression to describe it in order to achieve a satisfactory result. Do you still remember Frunzier's expression when we told him those stories in the very beginning? He almost knelt down to seek forgiveness from the Lord of Storms. Klein, Danitz, and company were momentarily unsure of the expression of words they should use to respond. Anderson leaned over to Gehrman Sparrow and said with a suppressed voice, "I think he has the talent to be a provoker." He appeared to be suppressing his voice, but his words could be heard by everyone present. Mobit didn't mind as he chuckled before continuing, "I know that you aren't very convinced and find it unbelievable that deities walk the lands, just like Edwina's previous reactions. I can give you 2 examples. The Chasm of Storm on Pasu Island and the Tenebrous Heaven in the Amantha Mountain Range were the divine kingdoms of the Lord of Storms and Evernight. They were divine kingdoms located on land. They were divine kingdoms separated from the real world by a mere illusory door. Pasu Island? Isn't that where the holy altar of the Church of Storms is? The Amantha Mountain Range. Amantha means serenity in Hermes. This refers to a holy cathedral, the Cathedral of Serenity. When the deities no longer walked the land, their kingdoms became the headquarters of their respective churches. Klein instinctively believed that Mobit Zoroast wasn't lying as he used it to come to certain conclusions. Danitz was puzzled and horrified by what he heard. He subconsciously wanted to leave, but when he saw his captain listening attentively, Gehrman Sparrow who was in thought, and Anderson Hood who wore a look of interest on his face, he could only hold back his urge as he sought a better, more comfortable seating position. At that moment, the elvish songster Ciadas, who was in charge of the perimeter, walked in and said with contempt, "Do not mention that fake god. The authority of the storm only belongs to the king of us elves." Her voice was clear and beautiful, but her tone was filled with anger and irascibility. It felt as though she would raise her hands at any moment to shoot an arrow at Mobit Zorost. "All right, I will use the words, fake god." Mobit raised his hand to adjust his sharp and hard black hat. Ciadas retracted her gaze. She then said to the former lone soldier, Frunzier Edward, who wasn't a staunch believer of the Lord of Storms, "It's your turn." Frunzier raised his head a little, his expression in a trance-like state. Apparently, he hadn't noticed the conversation and argument from before. He drew the iron-black sword beside him and walked towards the cave entrance. Klein observed for a moment and took the opportunity to speak to the elf, Ciadas. "Do you know of Queen of Calamity, Kohainam?" He wasn't actually sure if Kohainam was Elf King Saniathrim's subsidiary god, Queen of Calamity. His inquiry was for elvish songster Ciadas to give him the answer. Ciadas's gentle and exquisite face immediately produced a trance-like expression like Frunzier's. "I haven't heard her name in a long time. She is the queen of us elves." Mobit and Frunzier didn't even know of her existence. "Where did you encounter her? No, learn of her situation." As she spoke, Ciadas's tone became urgent. At that moment, Danitz looked at Gehrman Sparrow in surprise, reflecting over the revelation that the madman was so knowledgeable. He was even able to share a common topic of interest with an elf from ancient times. "I never expected you to be a scholar." "I really couldn't tell." "Couldn't tell at all," Anderson sighed as he shook his head. Vice Admiral Iceberg Edwina likewise cast her gaze at Klein. Her limpid blue eyes had a strong desire to learn from him. Klein answered frankly, "I've once entered a ruin belonging to Queen of Calamity Kohainam and obtained some items." "Ruin?" Ciadas ruminated over that word in a soft voice, her tone having seemingly lost something unimportant, but something that she couldn't bear to part with. From the situation inside, she might not be truly dead. After seeing Ciadas's eyes light up, Klein went straight to the point. "Do you have the Ocean Songster's potion formula? Can I use something to exchange for it?" He felt that being honest and direct with a Beyonder from the Storm Pathway was the best choice. Ciadas thought and said, "Use one of Her Majesty's items for the exchange. I only obtained a wine cup made of gold. It's already been crushed flat. Complicated patterns are engraved on it, with the elvish phrases Calamity and Kohainam." Klein didn't hide the truth. "I know about that cup. It was the cup Her Majesty loved the most," Ciadas said, unable to hide her excitement. "Deal. The cup is outside." Klein had no intention of heading above the gray fog in front of everyone. Ciadas nodded. "I understand. We will complete the transaction after we leave this book." Having said that, she pressed her palms together. "The storm will definitely belong to the elves." Before anyone spoke, she asked curiously, "What else did you discover there?" "Some murals depicting the elf king battling an ancient sun god." Klein shot a glance at the ascetic, snowman, who believed in the Lord that created everything, the omnipotent and omniscient God. With his back still facing the fire, the middle-aged man who was facing the stone wall finally opened his mouth. "No, he isn't the sun god. He is our Lord, the Father of all things, the great source of everything. He wasn't battling the Elf King, but taking back the authority which belonged to him." Just as Snowman said that, Ciadas stood up and aimed her arrow at him. Suddenly, this elvish songster's plaited black hair flared up in violation of the laws of nature. The strands of hair were distinct and they were all swirling with silver lightning, emitting a strange deep blue luster. Just as Ciadas was about to release the arrow, a huge grayish-blue palm appeared before her, blocking the arrow tip, without any fear of being struck. It was the palm of the giant, Grozel. One of the traits of this race was its exaggerated limbs. They were so long that they appeared a little distorted. Therefore, simply by sitting there, he could stop Ciata's by extending his arm. All right, Snowman, cut it out. As you know, Ciata's is an elf who likes to put actions before words, Grozel said to the ascetic before turning his head to the elvish songster. Ciata's, we are companions who can leave our backs to each other. We have experienced plenty of dangers together. You can retort Snowman and even beat him up, but do not attempt to harm him. As expected of the lead of the book. He's filled with positivity. But what's the difference in beating him and harming him? Klein couldn't help but mumble. Ciata's grunted and sat back down, turning the mood heavy and silent with a level of awkwardness. Giant Grozel used his single vertical eye to survey the area before chuckling. Then, I'll talk about my past. Before entering this book, I lived in the Giant King's court. I was one of the guardians of the waning forest. It's somewhere only our king can enter. Rumor has it that buried inside it are his parents, who also form the origins of us giants. The Giant King's court is formed of many parts, and the waning forest is one of them. Buried in there is the most ancient ancestor of the giants. Klein listened attentively, only wishing to ask more. To him, this was more valuable than the fourth epoch's history. This was because the city of Silver's hope likely laid in the Giant King's court. However, before he opened his mouth, Edwina spoke before him. Grozel, what did the book look like when you received it? Grozel raised his hand to rub his cheeks. It had nothing, like an empty book waiting to be written. I even thought that Grozel might be a completely fictional character in the book. Klein deliberated for a few seconds and didn't directly ask about the details of the Giant King's court. He turned to say to Mobit Zoroast, do you know of Blasphemer Amon? Blasphemer refers to the entire family of Amon. They are the archenemies of us Zoroasts. It's said that they have a very powerful and terrifying ancestor that even Ouroboros and Medici viewed with great importance. They even feel fear towards him, but no one knows of his actual name, Mobit introduced in detail. Ouroboros, Medici? Yes, back then the true creator and Rose Redemption supported the Solomon Empire. Klein's heart stirred as he immediately asked, then, have you heard of the name Sasser? Mobit was taken aback as he slowly shook his head. Never. Dark Angel Sasser's name and title vanished after the cataclysm? It was buried? Klein confirmed a fact through this. At that moment, Snowman, who was facing the stone wall, said with a deep voice, Sasser is the Dark Angel, the leader of the kings of angels, the one closest to the Lord. I was waiting for your answer. Klein cast his gaze on the ascetic and asked in a deep voice, apart from him, Ouroboros, Medici, and Amon, what other kings of angels are there? You don't have to say out all their names. Klein was afraid that it would result in unnecessary reactions, just like the Repenter in Afternoon Town. Edwina, Anderson, and Danitz were at a loss from the very beginning. This was because the contents of the conversation between Gehrman Sparrow and the few ancient figures were things that they had never heard of. They found it unbelievable that this crazy adventurer knew so many secrets. After a few seconds of silence, Snowman said, there's also the Angel of Imagination, Adam. Just as he said the name, the entire cave shook. The familiar and crazy tyrannical aura rapidly descended. King of the North Ulyssen had arrived. Chapter 699, Boss Fight Lone Soldier. Frunzier Edward, who was on guard by the cave's entrance, saw a massive figure descend from the sky just as he moved. It landed on a huge boulder covered in thick layers of ice. The wings, which were covered in a membrane of skin, weren't retracted as they continued spreading outward, nearly blocking out all the surrounding light. The illusory armored scales that resembled frozen ice and the violent eerie blue dragon eyes were immediately reflected in Frunzier's eyes. He instinctively sensed danger as he raised his iron-black sword and leaped to the side, rolling far away from where he was standing. Almost at the same moment, King of the North Ulyssen opened its mouth, silently spewing out a distorted icy blue flame towards the cave. It froze everything in its wake. Moments later, the icy blue flames produced a tidal wave formed from illusory light as they surged into the dark cave, sealing everything it passed in ice. The words, angel of imagination, Adam, were still flashing across Klein's mind as he couldn't help but recall Emperor Rozel's description of the Twilight Hermit Order. Their mission was to revive the original creator, and they had a high sequence beyonder of the spectator pathway among their ranks, or even the uniqueness. The means in which they summoned the members was through a true dream that connected the eastern and western ends of the continent. Furthermore, it had the characteristic of being detected upon being mentioned. But even so, he still instinctively reacted in response to the impending danger. He lunged sideways, dodging towards the uneven parts of the cave, attempting to use the rocks ahead to block the attack. However, the surging icy blue light was like a tidal wave that drowned every corner of the cave. It sealed everything, leaving no safe zones inside the cave. Seeing his surroundings turn into an icy cage, a gigantic, grayish-blue figure appeared before Klein's eyes. Rozel had stepped forward without a sound. He genuflected with his left knee, leaning his back forward as he stabbed the broadsword in front of him. Light that resembled the dawn of light bloomed as illusory walls formed to the left and right of Rozel, protecting everyone behind them. An icy blue, tidal wave surged over, splitting at the erect broadsword before colliding with the light of dawn on both sides. Everything in the mountain cave turned dark for Klein and company before a small source of light was restored. They could still see that the bonfire had been extinguished. It was especially dark with the dim rays of light outside attempting to tear through the layers of ice. At that moment, every inch of space in front of Rozel was frozen. The giant seemed to become a bug stuck in amber. Right on the heels of that, the sword which was embedded in the ground emitted a luster resembling the light of dawn. They mixed together, enveloping Rozel before turning into a hurricane of light that swept outwards. Silently, the layer of ice had a huge hole burned through it as it extended all the way to the cave's mouth. Rozel's grayish-blue figure had vanished from where he was. Elvish songster Ciadas, who hadn't had time to tie her head, held her bow and arrows. Embraced by the swirling gales around her, she charged out the cave without any delay. Dressed in an asymmetrical black coat, the Solomon Empire Viscount Mobit Zoroast mumbled, "Don't be in a rush," or, "It's finally here," as he ran, following closely behind Ciadas. The ascetic, Snowman, stood up as well. He tapped his chest 4 times as though he was forming the shape of a cross. "May the Lord bless me." Amidst his hoarse and dry voice, he stepped onto the biting cold ice with his bare feet and ran out of the cave. Klein didn't hesitate either. He didn't draw his revolver, and he kept his hands empty. Together with Anderson, who was clenching Death Bracadon tightly, they ran into the hole in the ice. Dressed in a shirt with complicated patterns, Edwina Edwards looked at Danitz, who was trembling due to the aura of the high-level entity. She said with a gentle, but emotionless tone, "Stay here." Having said that, the look in her blue eyes deepened. Gales howled around her, pushing her out of the cave. "Stay here." Danitz was stunned. He subconsciously surveyed his surroundings and saw the walls covered in frost and the completely extinguished bonfire. The cave was silent with him being the only one left. Danitz's trembling body slowly came to a stop as he turned agape. However, he didn't say a word as he saw his captain's figure disappear from the cave's entrance. Outside the cave, Frunzier Edward, who had just rolled to avoid the first series of attacks, saw Ulysses spread its wings as it was about to leap into the sky, closing the distance between it and his party. He ensured his safety as he steadied his figure and pushed his left palm out diagonally. Immediately following that, he declared a statement in ancient Hermes, "Flying is prohibited here." Suddenly, the frost dragon's wings that blotted out the sky seemed to be weighed down by invisible objects weighing 100 times its body weight. It began flapping them with great difficulty. The King of the North immediately let out a furious roar as the loud sonic boom drilled into Frunzier's ears, making his stagger. With a whoosh, the pair of wings finally managed to flap, stirring up the snow and frost around it into the air. Although it was difficult on Ulysses' part, it eventually managed to fly. At that moment, disciplinary paladin Frunzier's expression turned solemn. He said a sentence constructed in ancient Hermes once again, "Violators will be punished." Just as he said that, his figure leaped up at a speed which was faster than Ulysses, as though he had been augmented by some unknown power. Ding! Frunzier extended his body in midair as he brandished the iron-black sword in hand, striking down at the King of the North's neck with his posture speaking great certainty of a hit. A clear crack appeared on the crystalline armor plates as it spread slightly, however, this failed to make Ulysses bleed. The frost dragon didn't even feel the pain as its eerie blue eyes locked onto Frunzier, its expression cruel and tyrannical. It then lifted up its front claws while Frunzier remained in midair without any means of dodging. At that critical moment, a hurricane blew over, pushing the black-armored disciplinary paladin away, causing Ulysses' strike to swipe at air. Its strike caused an explosive boom despite the miss. Elvish songster Ciadas didn't hesitate to take action once she rushed out the cave, saving Frunzier immediately. Immediately following that, her hair flared up in violation of the laws of nature. They were distinct with swirling lightning bolts. She aimed her arrow at the large but slow, flying target in the sky, King of the North, before firmly pulling back the arrow. The sky turned dark, as though dark clouds had gathered as lightning bounced through them. Unable to fly smoothly due to the disciplinary paladin's influence, Ulysses suddenly pulled back its wings, swooping down at Ciadas like a high-speed train. At that moment, a grayish-blue figure that left one feeling safe had appeared in front of the King of the North's trajectory. Grozel genuflected once again, plunging the broadsword, which was unusable by human hands, in front of himself. Dawn-like light surfaced, forming an invisible, impenetrable wall. Boom! The collision between the frost dragon and Grozel was like a terrifying explosion. It shattered the layers of ice around them, pushing them outwards. Grozel failed to keep his footing firm as he flew out like a ball, tumbling past Ciadas before slamming loudly into the mountain wall. A huge amount of snow and ice stalactites crashed from above, nearly causing an avalanche. As for Ulysses, it wasn't sent retreating. It remained standing in its original spot. Having had its swooping attack interrupted, its hind legs were in the ground as its body leaned forward. It shook its neck before aiming its open mouth at Ciadas. The Solomon Empire's noble, Mobit Zoroast, had long arrived beside Ciadas. Upon seeing this, he hurriedly extended his right hand and rapidly turned his wrist. Ulysses forgot what it was doing despite having its mouth completely open. It stood there in a daze without continuing its attack. Suddenly, Mobit turned his head and spit to the side. Pooey. The spit was ordinary without any special traits to it. Seizing this opportunity, Snowman, the ascetic who came out, raised his arms as though he was embracing God's grace. Then, he said to the elvish songster in ancient Hermes, "God says it's effective." With a sizzling sound, the flashes of lightning surrounding Ciadas brightened greatly as they surged out, entangling with the arrow. She released her grip as an arrow shot out. Boom! Dark clouds gathered in the air as a thick bolt of lightning smote down, augmenting that arrow. The arrow turned completely silver, as though it was shot from the god of lightning. It struck Ulysses' forehead at a completely unavoidable speed. Layers of ice disappeared as the illusory armor plating cracked. The arrow stabbed into the King of the North's head, making it let out a deafening cry. Light blue blood gushed out and quickly froze as the frost dragon's ugly face shook violently as silver bolts zapped at it. At that moment, Klein and Anderson came out of the cave. Disciplinary paladin Frunzier had tumbled onto the ground before standing up again. Grozel extended his palms from the snow pile, rubbing his head. He didn't appear seriously injured. With so many teammates, I don't have to be the main assault force. I can attempt to control Ulysses' spirit-body threads. From my observations, it doesn't seem to have the defensive abilities of a demigod. Of course, it's much stronger than a sequence 5. A 5-meter radius is a little dangerous. Klein looked at the frost dragon as he quickly had an idea. Chapter 700, Excellent Teamwork. King of the North. Ulysses' tragic cries rapidly turned into a roar. Following that, a snowstorm engulfed the area outside the cave, reducing the visibility to less than 5 meters. Howling gales swept up dense goose feathers as they covered every inch of space. Meanwhile, an icy blue halo rapidly extended outwards, clinging close to the ground. It left frozen ice everywhere in its wake as it passed. Klein, who had his vision and hearing affected by the blizzard, instantly had the corresponding scene surface in his mind. He hurriedly bent his knees and kicked his heels, jumping high up, allowing the icy blue halo to sweep underneath him. As for Mobit Zoroast, who wasn't adept at combat, he was already too close to the icy blue halo when he noticed it. He didn't have the time to jump up. At that moment, he was hoisted up by his shoulders as the bottom of his feet had a tempestuous hurricane lift him up into the air. With this combination, he instantly flew up into the sky, avoiding the outcome of being frozen. Mobit turned his head and, without surprise, saw the deadpan Ciatas. This elvish songster could only muster up strong winds to glide forward due to the law forbidding flight. Anderson, Edwina, Snowman, and Frunzier reacted accordingly, jumping in time and dodging the attack without succumbing to it. Only Grozel, who had just pulled out his broadsword from the snow, was hit in the legs by the icy blue halo, as he couldn't dodge in time. Layers of ice instantly surged upwards as Grozel stood on the spot like a frozen corpse. Whoosh! The exaggerated blizzard obscured all the Beyonders' vision, making them lose their vision of the frost dragon. All they could do was passively defend against any attacks. At that moment, Snowman, who hadn't dropped to the ground, spread out his arms once again and said solemnly in ancient Hermes, "God says it's ineffective." The violent blizzard suddenly calmed down significantly. Be it the tempestuous hurricanes or the dense snowflakes, they were weakened or had been cut in half. Ciatas vaguely made out a gigantic face with an ugly lizard-like face. The broken arrow was still embedded in its forehead. Ulysses had taken the opportunity to close the distance between them. Ciatas didn't panic. The strong winds suddenly changed directions, sending Mobit and her floating backward. Meanwhile, her chilled, pale lips opened as she sang in ancient and abstruse Elvish, "The rocks are destined to be shattered by the waves, the trees are destined to be struck down by the winds, the mountains are destined to crumble by the lightning." As every word in Elvish was rich and filled with meaning, the constructed sentences were extremely succinct. Therefore, the lyrics didn't waste too much of Ciatas's time. Furthermore, from the moment the first word was spoken and from the beginning of the beautiful and forceful rhythm, the winds in the blizzard began to experience changes. The howling sounds of wind turned chaotic as it spread out in every direction. Ulysses' massive figure once again appeared before Klein and company's eyes. When Ciatas sang the third phrase, disciplinary paladin Frunzier had already pushed out his right palm and profoundly said in ancient Hermes, "Imprison." Instantly, the frost dragon which was about to rush Ciatas and Mobit had frozen on the spot. Surrounding it were layers of transparent walls. And as Frunzier said that softly, Edwina, who had just found her footing, made her light blue eyes turn black. Inside them flowed a sticky liquid that seemed to be the manifestation of all the evil in the depths of one's heart. She gently clenched her right palm as Ulysses stood up with a roar, instantly ripping apart the effects of imprison. The frost dragon's eerie blue eyes were filled with blankness and pain. It seemed to be still immersed in the emotions of sudden madness and ruthlessness. Even though this was a state it was always in, to have it fully triggered was uncomfortable. Without a doubt, it was a dragon who found it difficult to control its emotions. Seizing the opportunity of Ulysses' brief pause, Anderson Hood condensed a burning white spear in his hand. Then, he bent his back and threw it out. Without waiting for the outcome, flames appeared under the strongest hunter's feet, turning the ice into liquid. So, the spear accurately struck the frost dragon's half-open mouth, quickly melting the thick armor plates of ice, with the excess force penetrating the upper part of its forehead. Ulysses let out another tragic cry as its hind legs stomped backward, sending its body lunging forward. It stayed close to the ground as it rushed towards Anderson with a terrifying speed. The only thing in its eyes was this worm that had dealt significant amounts of damage to it. Schwing! The snow split apart as a deep and wide chasm opened up in the ground. It emanated all the way to where Anderson was as it continued extending. Bang! With its terrifying inertia, the frost dragon slammed into a boulder covered in thick ice, shattering its outer shell and cracking its interior. If Anderson had collided with it, the strongest hunter was bound to turn into meat paste. Even being brushed was likely to lead to his death. However, in a particular spot in the chasm where Anderson was originally standing, there was a dark hole that led straight down. It was just enough for a person to burrow in. Paw! A hand held onto the hole's entrance. Through the exertion of force, the strongest hunter with disheveled hair jumped out. After he threw the burning spear, he didn't dodge in panic. Instead, he directly used his Beyonder powers to melt the snow beneath his feet, and he burned the underlying soil. Silently, he created a hole that wasn't too deep. Following that, he sank himself into it by crouching, perfectly dodging the King of the North's charge. At that moment, a pure beam of light descended and struck Grosel, quickly melting the ice encasing him. Snowman had used an offensive blow to remove the restrictions placed on the giant guardian. With the explosive light of dawn, Grosel raised his broadsword and charged to the frost dragon with wide strides before cleaving down wildly. Bang! 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 Grosel was only a meter shorter than Ulyssen's non-humanoid form. His strength was equally ridiculous. As he clashed repeatedly with Ulyssen's front claws, occasionally wavering and retreating at times, he quickly recovered by taking a step forward and engaged his opponent. With the giant guardian occupying the frost dragon's attention, the others reacted accordingly with relative composure. Snowman maintained his spread arms as a sun-like halo appeared around him. It quickly spread outwards, warming up all his companions and giving them immense courage. Furthermore, he carefully ensured that it avoided the King of the North. Not far from him, Ciatas's hair flared up as she drew her bowstring. She shot out arrows that appeared to be formed by wind blades or lightning. Due to the massive target, every single one of her arrows had hit her target. Furthermore, all of the arrows struck the same spot, the frost dragon's shoulder. Mobit Zorost worked with Grosel, occasionally stealing the thoughts the King of the North had and was about to execute, making it pause briefly. At other times, he would attempt to steal its powers, but in the few times he didn't have any success. With the pitch-black sword, Anderson carefully circled to the frost dragon's flank and attempted to strike a particular spot. Disciplinary Paladin Frunzier brandished his iron-black sword, using Prohibition and Imprison to aid Grosel's brawl with the frost dragon. Without his restraints, even if the giant was a guardian, he would have long been sent flying, suffering from a fatal stomp or the spewing of breath. Klein looked at Edwina and raised his hand to point at himself. Invisibility. He didn't know if she had the ability to mimic this power. If it wasn't possible, he needed to consider using other methods. Edwina didn't ask why, as her light blue and limpid eyes immediately reflected Gehrman Sparrow's body, which lost its color and turned transparent. Following that, Klein's figure became faint and vanished. After confirming his condition, Klein quickly ran towards the intense clash between the giant and the dragon. With a roll, he arrived by the King of the North's left foot. Then, as he focused on dodging Ulyssen's feet while it did battle, he emanated his spirituality to control the illusory black threads with the spirit body threads vision he had long activated. Right on the heels of that, he would roll or leap around, in search of space beneath or around the frost dragon. So. Silver lightning arrows and pure azure wind blades landed in a small region, shattering the armor plates of ice, tearing apart the resilient skin. Soon, the frost dragon's right shoulder was a swath of light blue. The corresponding claw's motions also appeared to slow down indiscernibly. Disciplinary Paladin Frunzier acutely noticed this point. As he dodged the icy blue breath, he pointed in that direction and declared in ancient Hermes, "Death." With a bursting sound, the blue blood flowing from Ulyssen's right shoulder instantly dried up, and the tear allowed its translucent bones to be seen. At that moment, Edwina used a palm-sized brass mirror and reflected parts of Ulyssen's body in it. She reached out her right hand and grabbed at the mirror's surface, pinching the reflection within. Then, she forcefully pulled outwards. Ulysses' wound instantly worsened. It kept spreading as though it was about to lose one of its front claws. It let out a tragic cry as it suddenly raised its body, standing on its hind legs. Light blue light that was almost white surged out of the dragon. In 100-meter range, the temperature plummeted, followed by a fearsome force. Suddenly, all the Beyonders were sealed in ice. Their bodies became extremely cold as they turned very stiff. They couldn't help but tremble. Ciadas, Mobit, Edwina, Klein, Grosel, Anderson, and Frunzier all shared similar symptoms. The only one who barely maintained his mobility was the ascetic, Snowman, thanks to withstanding the training of being frozen countless times. He maintained his spread arms, half-closed his eyes, and solemnly said, "God loves everyone." Sunlight tore through the wind and snow as the warmth began to melt the feeling of being frozen. Bang! Ulysses sent Grosel flying with a claw, severely injuring the giant guardian by leaving a depression in his chest. It temporarily ignored the rest as it targeted Snowman, Blitz rushing him. Snowman has no one protecting him. It's about to move beyond a 5-meter radius. Klein watched this scene, feeling somewhat numb. He had the urge of running into the cave to pray to himself before using the sea god's scepter above the gray fog to respond. At that moment, a scarlet fireball appeared beside the ascetic before the frost dragon arrived. Then, it exploded without any reservations, sending him flying. It was from the strongest hunter, Anderson. At that moment, Edwina had produced a fireball in her hand and threw it at Ulysses' back, but she failed to hit it. She was creating a passageway for Klein to phase over with the fire. She had learned from Danitz of this ability Gehrman Sparrow had. Chapter 701, Giants Never Retreat. Ulysses arrived at Snowman's location, but he failed to hit anything. It slid past, leaving behind a deep chasm. Behind it, fireballs exploded afterward, producing bursts one after another. Klein's somewhat stiff figure flashed about thanks to the fire. The King of the North didn't manage to open up a gap from him as the 5 meters was maintained. By the time Ulysses came to a stop, Klein, who was still invisible, suddenly sensed something amiss. A corresponding scene appeared in his mind. He lunged forward as he clung close to the ground and appeared underneath the frost dragon. Meanwhile, Ulysses' thick and powerful tail had swung over, lashing it towards the nearby Ciadas and Mobit. Whoosh! With a loud crack, Mobit was sent flying as he dodged the frost dragon's tail. As for Ciadas, she failed to keep up. Although she had the aid of the gales to retreat and reduce the force, she had been struck in the side. The strike shattered the thick illusory scales that surfaced over her body while her ribs fractured. She was also thrown out, but thanks to the wind, she didn't fall too hard onto the snow. If it were Mobit or Anderson, this strike would have instantly killed them. Thankfully, the storm pathway had the corresponding illusory scales to protect her. Furthermore, every sequence advancement brought about corresponding improvements. Ciadas was only heavily injured, but she didn't lose consciousness. She didn't even completely lose her mobility. At that moment, Ulysses' neck moved as it widened its mouth, spewing out a light blue beam of light. The beam of light swept past Snowman, freezing him into an ice sculpture. Edwina, Frunzier, and Anderson were blocked by the huge dragon's body. They couldn't help him in time with the use of their other Beyonder powers because of the distance. Bang! The frost dragon leaped up a little and turned around. When it hit the ground again, it left a slight tremor. At that moment in time, it was clearly in a terrible state. The crack on its right shoulder was abnormally nasty. Although the frozen light blue liquid barely stopped the wound from worsening, its corresponding claw was nearly maimed and could hardly be used. Many of the illusory scales on its body had shattered and abnormally dimmed. It was as though they had lost large amounts of vitality. Regardless, it had severely injured and restrained 3 of its opponents. The situation was much better than before, especially with Grosel being seriously injured. It was no longer caught up in battle and could now attack as it wished. Upon seeing this scene, Edwina's light blue eyes turned black again. Sticky vile thoughts slowly flowed. She suddenly clenched her right palm, causing Ulysses to raise its head in a roar. It was an excruciating pain as light blue liquid flowed from the corner of its eyes and mouth. At that moment, the only thought on the frost dragon's mind was to purge the emotional disturbance from its spirit body. Taking the opportunity, Edwina's eyes lit up and turned extremely pure. The light of dawn around her had quickly materialized into a sword. She wanted to play the role of a guardian to fend off the King of the North. She believed that Gehrman Sparrow definitely had his reasons for staying by Ulysses' side while being invisible. All he needed was time. At that moment, a figure enveloped in the original light of dawn had charged at the frost dragon. It was none other than the giant, Grozel. His chest had sunk in. His grayish-blue skin was pale, and the broadsword in his hand had web-like cracks. However, he still bravely faced his enemy. Grozel cleaved at his target like he was burning up his life, emitting light and warmth. Giants never retreat. Amidst his roar, Grozel parried the frost dragon's repeated blows, and he managed to dodge the ice-blue breath in time due to its maimed front claw. Imprison. Frunzier ran over and began to restrict the King of the North's actions. Edwina also worked in tandem with him. Once Ulysses' rage allowed it to escape the restraints, she triggered its emotions again, allowing the restriction to continue and prevent the charge from happening again. At this moment, Anderson switched between throwing burning white spears and fireballs. Again and again, he dealt severe damage to the frost dragon. After Mobit managed to catch his breath, he continued stealing its thoughts or powers, stopping the frost dragon's attacks. Ulysses attempted to spread its wings a second time. It flew into the air a second time, sending snow flying, but with Frunzier adding another flight restriction, it could only give up when it sensed the difficulty in doing so. Klein, who kept switching positions by its feet, gained a deeper control of its spirit body threads. It had long reached the 20-second threshold, but he failed to achieve success. This was because the King of the North's spirituality was extremely potent. After a while, there was a clang. Grozel's broadsword was tainted by the frost dragon's breath as he was struck by its claw. The former shattered completely, turning into countless fragments as they flew everywhere. With sputtering sounds, the invisible walls in front of Grozel reached their limit as they let through several fragments that impaled his head and chest. Frunzier, who was similarly nearby, failed to dodge in time. The side of his armor collided with the fragments as his side was mangled. Giants never retreat. Grozel roared loudly once again. The light of dawn radiated from him once again as a sword made of pure light appeared in his palm. As the dark red blood on his face flowed, he parried the frost dragon's strike. At that moment, Klein was flicking the spirit body threads before he finally saw the opportunity to achieve initial control. 3 seconds. 2 seconds. 1 second. Ulysses' actions instantly froze as all its joints seemed to grow rust. The frost dragon immediately became alert and sensed that the source of the danger came from beneath it. Seizing the moment before its thoughts came to a complete halt, it instantly made the decision to sit down. It wanted to quash the despicable fella. Suddenly, its mind went adrift, having forgotten what it wanted to do. And about 20 meters away, Mobit Zorost's knees buckled as he sat strangely on the snow. Klein took the opportunity to move his feet, walking to the side of the frost dragon's hind legs at a decent speed. His invisibility was beginning to wear off. After all, the mimicked ability definitely couldn't compare with the original. He extended his hands halfway as his spirituality jumped, his actions akin to controlling a huge puppet. Bang! Ulysses, whose thoughts were already slowing down, finally recalled what it wanted to do. Its hind legs slowly bent as its hefty figure smashed downwards, but all it did was send snow and dust flying. No. No good. Have to do that. Thoughts flashed through its mind sporadically as its heart suddenly contracted, condensing a terrifying light blue halo. This was the Beyonder power stemming from its life. It could create a cold hell. With this, Klein and company would completely freeze. If not for Snowman's experience and powers being capable of restraining that state, more than one or two Beyonders would have died. However, with it under Klein's control, everything Ulysses tried to do was clearly impeded. Edwina acutely noticed the source of danger which she previously had no idea about. Immediately, she clenched her right fist, detonating the frost dragon's strong emotions. The King of the North's figure trembled in slow motion as the light blue halo that it had just converged scattered out of control. It failed to interfere with its environment. Ah, the frost dragon's mouth slowly opened as it let out a stuttering cry. Ciatas stood up with great difficulty the moment she recovered a little. Upon seeing the situation, she immediately held back her pain and drew her bow. Her hair flared up again as heavy dark clouds appeared in midair once again. Two different silver bolts of lightning added radiance to each other as they surged onto the bow, forming a terrifying arrow that swirled with a bolt of lightning. Ciatas's face twisted as she released the arrow. The silver bolt of lightning instantly penetrated Ulysses' chest with a whoosh, tearing open a ghastly wound. Flames spewed and lightning bolts sparked inside its wound, causing greater damage. At that moment, Anderson's eyes lit up. A blazing white flame enveloped his body as he transformed into a stream of light, accurately shooting straight for the wound. Pitch-black marks rapidly surfaced on the frost dragon's abdomen as though someone was scribbling over it. Ulysses' thoughts weren't as slow due to the intense stimulation. As it struggled to flap its wings, it soared up into the sky. Flying is prohibited here. Frunzier added more restrictions in a timely manner. Bang! King of the North fell to the ground again as its pitch-black marks on its abdomen tore open. Light blue blood and damaged organs spewed out like a waterfall. Anderson took the opportunity to jump away from the dragon's body. The flames over his body had extinguished as a transparent layer of ice covered him. Cold. It's really cold. He held Death Brachydont as he stiffly jumped away. His body was constantly trembling. Klein, who had nearly allowed the frost dragon to escape his binding, achieved initial control again. He made Ulysses' thoughts of making everyone present die with it slow down as it suffered from theft and explosions. Its long neck slowly looked up as it let out a slow whimper as its body collapsed bit by bit. During this process, Klein didn't attempt to stop Ciatas and company's continued attacks. He knew very well that to turn the frost dragon into a marionette needed far more than 5 minutes. There were too many accidents that could happen in that span of time. Frunzier stood straight while panting. With the side of his body mangled, he pushed forward his swordless palm and declared in ancient Hermes, "Death." Ulysses' body trembled as it collapsed to the ground like a small mountain made of ice. Light blue light that was nearly white was released from its body as its flesh and body quickly disintegrated. Soon, the gigantic dragon corpse turned into a snow-laden heavy door that swung outwards. Without anyone mentioning it, all the Beyonders present knew that it was a door leading to the outside world. Finally. Finally. Success, Grosel laughed out loud as his voice grew softer. Thud. His nearly 4-meter-tall figure fell forward as he held himself up with a knee. Following that, the light of dawn around him scattered as his aura was almost immediately gone. Grosel. Ciatas and company went over with great difficulty or great speed. Grosel looked around him slowly, clenching his fist as he gave a good-natured laugh. We succeeded. Giants never retreat. His head with the single vertical eye drooped down when his voice came to a halt. Chapter 702, Epilogue, Grosel. Frunzier, who was closest to the giant, rushed to Grosel and caught him. Then, he slowly released his grip and stood up, as though he had just experienced a confusing dream. Ciatas tore out of Mobit's arms, and ignoring the pain all over her body, she ran to Grosel's side with the aid of the wind. She bent down and carefully observed for a moment. Then, she nudged the giant and hysterically shouted, "Wake up! Wake up! It's time for us to leave." Her voice softened into silence. Mobit stood by the side, seeing the giant unable to maintain his body as it wavered. Finally, it fell to the ground with a thud. He fell silent for a few seconds before exhaling. At that moment, Anderson and Edwina had already run to Snowman. One used a flame, while the other mimicked holy light to quickly defrost him. As Klein was nearby, he directly arrived by Grozel's side. His spirit body thread's vision told him that the giant was dead. Only his spirit lingered, but it was beginning to scatter. This made his damage transfer powers completely useless. From the moment Grozel ignited the light of dawn and engaged the frost dragon in a second battle, he must have prepared himself for death. Klein fell silent. Mobit glanced at him and said with a rueful smile, "To be frank, I've not seen many giants. Most of my impression of them had come from books, teachers, and parents. I always thought that this race was cruel and violent, unintelligent creatures who were closer to monsters. However, Grozel wasn't like that. He was frank, honest, and optimistic. Although he might appear rather silly, he knew better than anyone what was right and wrong. He told me that this was because he wasn't one of those ancient giants. He wasn't even a second or third generation giant. The cruel and violent giants similarly had the ability to reproduce and give birth. As for their descendants, there would be more rational ones appearing from time to time. These descendants would reproduce and have more descendants, allowing the entire giant race to escape from the confines of being monsters. I don't know if I should believe him, but his existence has proven the possibility." As Mobit said that, he suddenly paused as though immersed in his memories. At that moment, Edwina and Anderson helped Snowman, whose body was still a little stiff, walk over. The ascetic struggled as he walked to Grozel's side. Looking at the tightly closed single eye, Snowman gestured the sign of the cross on his chest. He half closed his eyes as he whispered a prayer. "Father of all things, the great source of everything, here lies an honest and pure soul. May he enter your kingdom and receive eternal redemption." Ciadas opened her mouth as though she wanted to say that Grozel's faith was in giant King Ormer, but she ultimately chose to keep silent. She watched in silence as Snowman completed the prayer. "We have to leave as quickly as possible. No one knows how long this door will remain open," the elvish songster said as she surveyed the surroundings. Her sorrow and pain left her rather quick-tempered. She looked down at the giant and added in a heavy voice, "We can't let Grozel's soul dissipate in this illusory world. We have to bring him back to reality." "All right," Mobit immediately agreed. Klein and company didn't object either. Edwina turned her head and shouted at the mountain cave of ice and snow. "Danitz, you can come out now." At that moment, Ciadas's eyes darted around as though she had recalled something. She turned her head and said to Klein, "Do you have a pen and paper?" "Yes." Klein took out the fountain pen and notes he brought around with him. This was a professional trait of being a seer. Ciadas received it and began scribbling on it. She didn't stop, even when Danitz ran out of the cave. Danitz kept silent. He was also in low spirits as well, lacking the joy and excitement he should have with the pending departure from this book world. Finally, Ciadas stopped writing and handed the paper and pen to Klein. "The formula you wanted. Aren't we completing the trade only after leaving?" Klein mumbled silently in puzzlement. He received the pen and the ocean songster potion formula. As though sensing his puzzlement, Ciadas turned her head and looked at Grozel. She said with a heavy voice, "We are now companions. So you can give me the potion formula directly?" Klein put the items away and nodded indiscernibly. "I'll give you the wine cup after we leave." Ciadas didn't respond. Instead, she nudged Mobit. "Bring Grozel along." Mobit looked down at his body, which wasn't too muscular, in his sharp, curvy leather boots. He gave a bitter smile of helplessness and walked to Grozel's thigh. Frunzier silently followed as he bent down to embrace the giant's left shoulder. Anderson looked around and sked. "All of you are injured or weak. Let me do it." He then lifted up Grozel's other shoulder. Klein was just about to help with the other thigh when Danitz rushed over to take the spot. Upon seeing this, he stopped in his tracks. He then watched Anderson and company lift Grozell as they walked towards the illusory snow-laden door. Klein, Edwina, Ciadas, who stumbled as she walked, and Snowman silently followed beside them before they arrived at the exit formed from Ulysson's corpse. At that moment, Klein surveyed the area and discovered that the light blue blood that flowed out from the King of the North had vanished. It was as though it had never existed. Indeed, it's a conjured monster that's almost real. Klein walked behind as he watched Edwina take a few steps forward as she bent her back, placing her palms on the door. Then, Vice Admiral Iceberg exerted her strength and pushed open the snow-laden door. Silently, everyone saw everything disappear after turning illusory then transparent. Rows of brownish-yellow bookshelves quickly appeared before their eyes, along with the orange-yellow sun which had just set below the horizon and a desk with a fountain pen, ink bottle, and paper. This was Vice Admiral Iceberg Edwina's cabin. Klein quickly placed the middle of the table in his sights. Sitting on it was a book filled with yellowish-brown goatskin. The book flipped to the end as a result of a formless wind. Klein and company then saw the epilogue. With the help of the crazy adventurer and the strongest adventurer, Grozell fulfilled his promise. He led his teammates and slayed the King of the North, but he also ended up sleeping forever in the Nation of Frost. It didn't even give our ending. Ciadas, where do you plan on heading to next? Mobit released Grozell's thigh as he turned his head to ask the elvish songster. Ciadas's eyes seemed to glaze over for a few seconds before she firmly said, "Seek out my race." Just as she said that, she suddenly saw Mobit's flaxen-colored hair rapidly turn white. His originally smooth face had obvious wrinkles. In just a second, Mobit was dying of old age. Ciadas's heart tightened. Just as she was about to lunge forward, she was surprised to realize that she had lost the strength in her legs at some point in time. With a thud, she fell to the ground and realized that the back of her hands were covered in the aged spots of an elder. She instantly understood what was happening as tears immediately flowed down her face. She struggled as she attempted to crawl towards Mobit. Mobit had similarly slumped to the ground as he crawled towards her while extending his right palm. Ciadas reached out her right palm and grabbed the wrinkled and thin hand. They raised their heads with great difficulty as their pupils reflected one another. The corners of their mouths curled up simultaneously before loosening weakly. Their eyelids drooped down and blocked out the light. Klein, Edwina, Anderson, and Danitz failed to react in time to such changes. They had no idea what they could do as they helplessly watched Grozell's corpse rapidly rot as his flesh and blood evaporated, leaving his skeleton and Beyonder characteristic. As for Mobit, Ciadas, Snowman, and Frunzier, they aged in seconds before breathing their last breath and repeating whatever had happened to Grozell's corpse. Their clothes had either disappeared or turned to dust. Their souls dispersed at extraordinary speeds before they were gone. Even the one who lived inside the book for the shortest time had been there for 165 years, Edwina muttered softly as she turned her head to look at that bones which faced the sea and sun. It was none other than disciplinary paladin Frunzier. He was sitting on a chair looking west, where Backlund was. Snowman was seated cross-legged to the side. His corpse maintained the posture of praying. That's right. They've lived in the book world for centuries or millennia. With the rules of the outside world, as non-demigods, they should have died long ago. I should have realized this. Why wasn't I wary of this point at all? Could it be? Klein suddenly recalled the psychological influence on Mobit, Grozell, and company as he began having an idea. He once again looked down at the book bound by goatskin. He believed that it had many, many more secrets. This fellow is rather interesting. He died just like that. Anderson looked at Mobit's corpse as he smirked. At that moment, all the Beyonder characteristics had slowly condensed. However, Frunzier didn't produce anything similar to that. Edwina observed for a moment before softly saying, the potion he consumed was illusory, likewise for the strength he obtained. It's just like that frost dragon. It was likely conjured in the book world. It was almost real. Klein sighed silently. He was momentarily at a loss for words, so all he could do was maintain Gehrman Sparrow's silence. In the next 10 minutes, no one spoke in the captain's cabin of the Golden Dream until the 4 Beyonder characteristics took form. One of them was the size of a fist resembling a heart. It was covered with holes as it shimmered with the light of dawn. Another resembled a jellyfish. Its translucent exterior seemed to contain azure-blue seawater, and inside it were vortices that were occasionally stirred by hurricanes or flashing silver lightning while emitting a faint, ethereal song. Another was a pure, bright crystal that exuded holiness. The last was a baby's palm with 5 thin stretched-out fingers as it kept changing colors due to the environment. Sigh, we can't just keep watching like this. Finally, Anderson broke the silence. Let's split the Beyonder characteristics. Just as Edwina's light blue eyes were dyed with pangs of fire, the hunter shrugged and said with a wry smile, I believe that they'll have wishes such as this, as we were companions who fought together. Chapter 703. Thank you. Present. Seeing Edwina's gaze warm up, Anderson curled the sides of his mouth and shook his head with a sigh. You're always so inflexible. That's why you aren't able to become an artist your entire life. After sighing again, he looked at the corpse on the chair. We can't keep watching. We have to do something. Doesn't Ciada's wish to find her race? Let's bury her near an elvish ruin in Sonia Island. Mobit looks like he wants to be with Ciada's. We should bury them in the same tomb. Doesn't Frunzier want to return to Backlund? Burn his remains to ashes, store the ashes in a box, and bring it to the city when possible. If time permits it, then someone can look for his descendants. As for Snowman, it's not known if he believes in the ancient sun god or the original creator. Who knows if the two are the same? To us, it's the same. There's definitely no way to find the corresponding cathedrals or altars. Therefore, the only thing we can do is bury him beside Grozel. Grozel. He wishes to return to the Giant King's court, but that's a city in myths and legends. There's no way to find it in the real world. However, there are giant ruins in the northern and southern continent. We can bury him there and allow him to have a proper burial. Giant King's court. Backlund. Klein listened in silence as he deliberated for a few seconds. Leave the ashes of Grozel, Snowman, and Frunzier with me. He believed that in the time to come, the City of Silver would manage to reach the Giant King's court. When that happened, he could hand Grozel's and Snowman's ashes to Little Sun and allow him to bury the 2 ancient figures. As for Backlund, Klein needed to return to it, as it was the final destination of his travels. He could then bring back Frunzier, who had left his hometown for more than 165 years. Edwina added, the Golden Dream often goes to Sonia Island. I'll handle Sonia Islands and Mobit's remains. All right. You'll be in charge of the cremation later. Anderson turned to look at Danitz as he chuckled and sighed. Look, everyone plays a part in this. There's no need to feel inferior. He originally imagined that Danitz wouldn't understand his consoling and would glare at him angrily. To his surprise, this well-known pirate's expression turned heavy as he nodded in silence. Ahem. As companions who face the King of the North together, let's each choose one. Treat it as though we're inheriting their legacy. Anderson gestured at the shimmering items on the floor. These Beyonder characteristics definitely have remnants of their psyche. I wonder what kind of influence they will bring. Be it concocting it into a potion for consumption or getting an artisan to craft it into an item, there should be something special about them. The former can be digested with the acting method, but nothing can be done about the latter. From the looks of it, you don't know the acting method. Treat it as though I didn't say a thing. The last 2 lines were said to Danitz. Klein didn't have the mood to lampoon Anderson. He looked at the 4 Beyonder characteristics and said, give Ciada's to me. This was the main ingredient of an ocean songster. Edwina thought for a moment before saying, I'll take Snowman's. It corresponded to the Priest of Light which Klein already had one of. Hence, he didn't choose it. Anderson glanced at the remaining two Beyonder characteristics as his gaze paused at the strange item that resembled a baby's palm. I have to say that this guy is very interesting. Perhaps it can be made into a mystical item that can talk to me. That way, everyone wouldn't be too lonely. At that moment, the giant's heart didn't have an owner. Klein glanced at Danitz and indifferently said, "It's yours." "Mine? I didn't do anything. I didn't participate in the battle." Danitz was extremely surprised. Klein said simply, "You scouted and took on a risk." To Klein, this was a form of compensation. This was because Danitz had chanted the fool's honorific name and knew Gehrman Sparrow's secret. Therefore, he had to force the faith of the fool on him, otherwise, it would only leave latent risks. Although this was a risk which Danitz was willing to take, Klein still wished to compensate him. Of course, he hoped that Danitz would view it as a bestowment from the fool. And regardless of exchanging Grozel's Beyonder characteristic for money, using it to purchase the corresponding formula and ingredients, or making it into a defensive mystical item, all of them would be very useful for Danitz. "Take it," Edwina said as she looked at Danitz. "All right." Danitz nodded after a few seconds of silence. After distributing them, Klein took a few steps forward and bent his back to pick up Ciatas's Beyonder characteristic. Looking at the azure-blue seawater sloshing inside the translucent membrane, he could vaguely hear the elf's beautiful singing. Just as he stood up, he saw Danitz nodding as though he was responding to a question. However, no one had spoken. Klein's gaze swept past Edwina's expressionless face and suspected if this mysticism magister was communicating with Danitz in a way others couldn't hear. Seeing Danitz give an affirmative answer, Edwina reached out to pick up Grozel's travels from the desk and closed it. She then handed it to Klein. "This is a token of my gratitude. Without me, all of you would have defeated the frost dragon." Klein didn't reach out his hand as he looked at the book comprised of yellowish-brown goatskin. "No, we definitely would have died. We had no way to defend against the King of the North's final frenzy. Besides, you were taking a huge risk entering the book." Edwina was like a teacher, explaining to him the reasons in a serious manner. "My only request is that you will tell me the answers if you figure out its origins and principles." Klein was very curious about the secrets hidden in Grozel's travels. He couldn't reject the offer as he reached out to take the magical book. "Okay." At this moment, the importance of the Giant King's court became more obvious. He even thought of buying the black iron key belonging to the giants and was worth 5,000 pounds while he was at it. However, he didn't immediately make the request, to prevent Edwina from thinking that he was trying to fleece her. He prepared to wait a few more hours, or perhaps tomorrow, before borrowing the key from Vice Admiral Iceberg. He would head above the grey fog to divine its worth before offering to purchase it. Seeing Anderson and Danitz pick up their Beyonder characteristics, Edwina glanced at the darkening sky and said to Klein, "Where are you heading to next?" "Biyao," Klein replied frankly. Edwina nodded. "You can head there on the Golden Dream. We have plenty of rooms." Klein nodded indiscernibly as he agreed. Who wouldn't want a free ride? After dealing with the remains and cleaning up the captain's cabin, Edwina walked to the door and opened it. There were gasps of pleasant surprise as the mood in the corridor turned jubilant. "All right, it's fine now." Edwina looked around as a smile formed from her cold expression. The crew cheered loudly, making Anderson stroke his chin and frown. "It's more exaggerated than I imagined," without a doubt, his words were drowned by the ebullient cheers. After everything came to an end, Klein and Anderson left the captain's cabin under Danitz's lead and headed for other rooms on the same level. Half turning his body to look where they were, Anderson suddenly sighed. "Is that it? Although we didn't get to know each other for more than half an hour, people who fought alongside you often leave a deep impression. But to think they suddenly died in a baffling manner." All of them. Klein was silent for 2 seconds before saying, "This world is filled with baffling deaths to begin with." "That's right." Anderson immediately smiled. "That's why optimism is needed to enjoy life. If I were to face death one day, I'll definitely be composed and cool, not losing my elegance at all. I would face it in the most handsome manner possible. Don't raise flags for yourself. Klein didn't say a word as he entered the room Danitz opened for him. Anderson took the room beside him. In the room, Klein stood at the window as he silently watched the darkening sea for nearly 10 minutes. Then, he entered the bathroom, took 4 steps counterclockwise, recited the incantation, and went above the gray fog. Sitting at the high back chair of the fool, he conjured the world's figure and made him make a praying pose. Honorable Mr. Fool, please inform the sun that I've obtained the sequence 6 notary potion formula he wants. I also have clues to the Priest of Light formula and main ingredients. He can delay payment by putting it on credit and pay for it in the future. Klein was doing this to prepare for his advancement to sequence 4. The City of Silver had rich resources, so it was possible that particular main ingredients or difficult supplementary ingredients that were hard to come across would exist over there. Therefore, with him in no rush to get anything, he planned on letting Little Sun owe him. The reason why he didn't say that he had obtained the main ingredients and potion formula for Priest of Light was because he felt that it was too exaggerated. He planned on telling him once Little Sun was more or less done digesting the potion. After checking the conjured scene twice, he transmitted it into the crimson star representing the sun as a stream of light. Afternoon Town. Having just finished patrolling the periphery of the newly established camp, Derek's vision suddenly blurred, and he saw an endless gray fog and an indistinct figure praying inside a dark red glow. Immediately following that, he heard the world's voice and learned that his notary potion formula had been acquired. Mr. World's efficiency is really high. It's the exact number of days that he promised. Furthermore, he even got clues to the Priest of Light potion formula and main ingredients. Derek felt joy after a moment of alarm. He couldn't help but admire the world, wishing that he would possess similar strength and styles in the future. Above the gray fog, the world made another prayer after Mr. Fool confirmed that there weren't any problems with the Ocean Songster potion formula. Honorable Mr. Fool, please inform Mr. Hanged Man that I've already obtained the Ocean Songster's potion formula and the corresponding main ingredient. I'll give it to him during the next tarot gathering. Please get him to consider what he would like to provide in exchange. Chapter 704, Origins on the Undulating Sea, inside an ancient and dark sailboat. Alger Wilson stood in front of a window, considering the report he had to produce when he arrived at Pasu Island. It was at that moment when the endless gray fog and a figure lording over him appeared. He then saw a dark red glow and saw a blurry figure resembling the world. He then heard the figure's calm words. After hearing it, Alger's eyes widened. He found it difficult to suppress his joy as a strong sense of bewilderment and shock emerged within his heart. He remembered very clearly that the world had only promised the sun to obtain the notary potion formula within 3 days at the last Tarot Club gathering. He hadn't mentioned anything related to the Ocean Songster potion formula, but in just days, this gentleman had obtained the rare Sequence 5 formula and even its main ingredient. What did he do exactly? Alger muttered silently to himself as he couldn't help but recall Gehrman Sparrow's cold and formidable appearance. He found the man more and more unfathomable. Is this the advantage of being a blessed? Yes, I just received the news yesterday that Gehrman Sparrow boarded the Future last week in Nas. On the one hand, it proves that Admiral of Stars is indeed the Hermit, and on the other hand, it means that what the world did last week was extremely important. For example, entering those dangerous waters in the Eastern Front to obtain something. Therefore, he had no choice but to seek the Hermit's help. As such, he advanced and became a Sequence 5 powerhouse. This can explain how he obtained the Ocean Songster potion formula and its main ingredient in the span of a few days. But what did he do exactly? Don't tell me that he killed someone from the middle upper echelons of the church. Alger couldn't help but frown. He quickly calmed his heart as he focused on another matter. Although instantly obtaining the formula and main ingredient delighted and excited him, making him feel that becoming a Tarot Club member was a turning point in his life, he still needed to pay for it. What can I give the world? Alger fell into deep thought, depressed to realize that he didn't have any items or money of equal value. He subconsciously paced about his window. Above the gray fog, the busy world vanished as Klein cast his eyes on Grosel's travels, which he had brought above the gray fog. This book, comprised of yellowish-brown goatskin, was silently placed on the long bronze table. It didn't appear special in any way, appearing so ordinary that only history fans would notice it. Klein conjured a pen and paper as he cautiously wrote the first divination statement. This is the spectator pathway's uniqueness. He was most worried about this point, as it meant that he couldn't seal the book above the gray fog. It might bring about unexpected accidents, but carrying it with him made it possible for him to be sucked into the book at any time. That would be very problematic. He undid the spirit pendulum on his left wrist, composed himself, and attempted a divination. When he opened his eyes, the topaz pendant was spinning counterclockwise. It meant a negative result. From the looks of it, this strange book isn't the spectator pathway's uniqueness. Then, there's no need to be too afraid. Klein thought for a few seconds before divining if Grosel's travels was the corresponding item of the spectator pathway's sequence 1 or 2. To his surprise, the divination ended in a failure. He thought for a long while before penning a new divination statement, its origins. The reason why Klein dared to do such a divination was because he knew very well that the spectator pathway's sequence 0 had long perished. There was a high chance that the uniqueness was in the hands of the Twilight Hermit Order. Therefore, the chances of him having to face a real god was negligible. Putting down the pen and holding the paper and book, Klein leaned back into the chair and recited the divination statement as he entered a dream with cogitation. The gray, hazy world cracked open as the sky turned extremely dark. It was as though strong winds were stirring the dark clouds. In this dark environment, a sliver of light appeared first along the horizon as it grew bigger and clearer. It was a floating continent. It was a huge continent that could hold several cities. The continent's periphery was grayish-white in color. Huge boulders revealed their outlines, and above them, there were dozens of erect 100-meter-tall stone columns. They either stood independently or propped up magnificent ancient palaces. Dragons of different colors, grayish-white, scarlet-red, yellowish-bronze, as well as some made of ice, were flying over the continent and the one-of-a-kind city. At times, they would land on a stone column to rest as they overlooked the land. At other times, they would enter the opulent palace and vanish from Klein's sight. Among them, the smallest one was about the size of King of the North Ulyssan. The biggest spanned 100 meters. The scene quickly zoomed in as a palace with a height of over 200 meters occupied Klein's vision. Its interior had stone columns erected, propping up a dome. The space was so large that it allowed any dragon to move freely within. The camera kept moving inward, and soon, Klein saw a book made of yellowish-brown goatskin. Its cover was blank as it floated in midair. Compared to its surroundings, it was amazingly small. Right behind the book, a large shadow appeared. Just as the shadow's silhouette was outlined, Klein felt his thoughts instantly explode. His eyes spewed out with blood as his ears were left with 2 black holes. His mouth and nostrils had white matter stained with blood spew out from them. The mysterious space above the gray fog gently trembled as it pacified everything. Klein quickly recovered as he gritted his teeth and rubbed his head. It hurts. It freaking hurts. It's in no way inferior to the eternal blazing Sunday. I didn't even discern his looks or gain any knowledge. Was he dragon of imagination Ankwelt? According to Little Sun's information, he had perished at the end of the second epoch. After so many epochs, spanning 2 to 3 millennia, just prying into the mystery was enough to put me in such a sorry state. If not for the gray fog screening and assistance, I would have died immediately. This mark is way too powerful, isn't it? There's no way of comparing them. Its damage is inferior to the previous encounter with the eternal blazing sun, but one had died long ago, while the other is still alive. It just begs the question if the ancient gods are stronger than the real gods of the present day. Using nearly a minute to recover from the pain, Klein recast his gaze on Grosel's travels. He tapped the model table's edge and muttered silently, "This book's author is Dragon of Imagination Ankwelt?" A book written by an ancient god, a storybook that can automatically deduce the ending? What is his goal? When this book was formed, the dragon of imagination likely hadn't encountered the ancient sun god and was fine. After all, it would take some time to go from the city of miracles, Liveseed, to the giant king's court. And before Grozel was swallowed by the book, the giant king's court was clearly still in existence. Just a prank? A toy used to kill his boredom? Or could it be that the dragon of imagination had foreseen some of the future? He specially created this book to leave behind a chance for himself or the dragons to resurrect. However, he underestimated the ancient sun god's might, and he completely perished. It made the book unusable for millennia, so all it could do was naturally absorb characters into it to play out a story. Klein made some guesses, but he wasn't able to verify them. After some consideration, he thought of finding a chance to enter the book in search for clues. In the future, I can enter as a spirit body above the gray fog. Once I encounter any trouble, I'll immediately return. Yes, I'll make the attempt after I'm no longer with Edwina and Anderson. I have to be careful and cautious. Klein nodded as he divined if leaving Grozel's travels above the gray fog would bring undesirable changes to the mysterious space, but he was met with failure again. As for the reason, he actually knew why. This was a place that transcended the spirit world. Divining about matters involving this area naturally failed if attempts were made to obtain revelations from the spirit world. After deciding to frequently come above the gray fog to take a look so as to prevent any accidents, Klein threw Grozel's travels into the junk pile. He then waved his hand, summoning a golden wine cup that had been partially flattened. The cup had complicated patterns engraved on it, with the elvish phrases, Calamity, and Kohinum. Apart from that, there wasn't anything special. With it in hand, Klein silently rubbed it for a few seconds. Knock, knock, knock. Klein politely knocked on the door to the captain's cabin. Is there something? Edwina, who had let down her hair, looked at Gehrman Sparrow and asked. Klein handed over the elf queen's golden wine cup. Put this in Ciatas's tomb. All right. Edwina fell silent for 2 seconds before nodding and receiving it. She habitually studied the engravings and symbols on the cup before withdrawing her gaze in embarrassment. She then looked out the window and said, "They'll be organizing a bonfire party. Will you be participating?" No. Klein shook his head. I understand. I don't plan on participating either. Not everyone is like Anderson, who can quickly raise his spirits, Edwina said with pursed lips. Actually, it's not necessarily a bad thing. Klein was momentarily at a loss for a response. And apart from giving lessons, Edwina wasn't good at socializing. Immediately, the two of them fell silent. About 10 seconds later, Klein silently inhaled and broke the silence. Are you selling that key that originates from the giants? Yes. Edwina thought about it before glancing at her collector's room. She added, I can lend it to you for studying. You can decide whether to buy it before leaving the ship. Chapter 705, Mythical Creature. You didn't even need me to mention it. I was still a little embarrassed to raise the subject. Klein secretly heaved a sigh of relief. After considering Gehrman Sparrow's persona, he calmly said, I do not take advantage of others. Just as he said that, he felt a little regretful. He was afraid that Vice Admiral Iceberg would really change her mind. Edwina's light blue eyes moved slightly as she said, the only condition is that you have to tell me the answer to anything you figure out. Phew. Klein didn't harp on the issue as he nodded. Okay. About a minute later, he carried an iron black key the size of a heptacord. And at that moment, there was a series of fervent singing from the deck. Your eyes are so mesmerizing that it feels like the light from dawn. When night comes and the sun has gone down, I almost start feeling melancholy, fervently awaiting your light. Oh, your eyes are so mesmerizing that it feels like the light from dawn. Klein subconsciously went to the window and looked out. He saw that the bonfire had already been lit, and the Golden Dreams crew, that had nothing to do on their hands, were gathered around it. They were either roasting meat or fish as they guzzled beer. Otherwise, they would be dancing a rather random but lively dance alongside singer Orpheus's singing. It was a very merry atmosphere. The oily roasting exuded a tantalizing aroma that wafted upwards. Klein saw that Anderson Hood was also among the pirates, drinking in high spirits and eating happily. From time to time, he would shout a few words and say a joke, as though he was already a member of the Golden Dream. He was no longer ostracized like before. Instead, Danitz didn't appear among them. At the very least, Klein didn't see him near Iron Skin or Barrel. As long as he doesn't provoke others, Anderson is rather good at socializing. This might be the intelligence-gathering powers of a conspirer. Yes, he might have transferred the hatred onto me. I wonder if Danitz will work hard after what happened. If he can improve himself and acquire greater strength, then as the fool, I wouldn't only have myself as a subordinate. I don't have to always appear as a trinity. This secret existence of mine finally has a real believer, someone I can directly order to do things, even though it's only limited to Danitz. I have to say, it's still quite pathetic. As Klein reflected over the matter, he prepared a ritual to sacrifice the giant's key above the gray fog. At that moment, his spiritual perception was triggered as he instinctively activated his spirit vision and looked to the side. White bones were thrown up as they materialized into the messenger with black flames in its eye sockets. Half of the messenger's body was in the lower deck, so it was nearly level with Gehrman Sparrow without tearing through the ceiling. However, the palm holding the letter remained huge, as though it could easily wrap it around Klein's head. Mr. Azek was quite quick to reply this time. As Klein politely nodded, he received the letter and unfolded it. Just as he was about to read its contents, he suddenly realized that the skeleton messenger remained standing there. It didn't vanish once it delivered the letter. "Is there something?" Klein asked in surprise. Just as he said that, an idea flashed through his mind as he quickly added, "If there's a need to reply, then I will summon you again." The skeleton messenger's huge head nodded as its body collapsed like a waterfall before returning to the underworld. Ma'am Rionette Tynker previously waited for me to give a reply, same for the skeleton messenger this time. Is this some new regulation the messenger world has enacted? Pooey. There's no such thing as a messenger world. They're all individually summoned, and most messengers are just doing it part-time. Yes, the skeleton messenger gave me an aggrieved feeling. Klein shook his head without much thought before focusing his attention on Mr. Azek's letter. To put it simply, attaining godhood begins from the moment one advances to sequence 4. It's a slow process of evolution towards a mythical creature. This process comes to an end at sequence 2. Therefore, there is a qualitative difference between an angel and a saint. In ancient times, the former are even called subsidiary gods. Every demigod, including saints and angels, have their own mythical state. This is a non-human form which is a potpourri of complex knowledge, godhood characteristics, and secret symbols. Ordinary people will suffer tremendous damage from a simple glance, to the point of losing their minds. And as the demigod grows in strength, the damage only grows more potent and irresistible. Therefore, creatures at this level have to constantly control themselves to not expose this form, or just from their very existence alone, it can bring about a catastrophe to their surroundings. To demigods, one of the main traits of losing control is losing reason. When that happens, they will no longer be able to restrain their mythical creature form. However, a saint's mythical form isn't complete. There are clear characteristics of their original race. Strictly speaking, one is a true mythical creature only after they reach sequence 2. I wonder if the blood that Ma'am Hermit wants is the blood of a mythical creature in the true sense of the phrase, or if the criteria can be relaxed. I wonder if the placenta blood from Will Septon's birth counts. He is a sequence 1 snake of fate, an absolute mythical creature, just not in the correct form. I'll accumulate more matters before writing on the paper crane to ask him. Yes, there are only 2 more times, so I need to do it for serious matters. However, I'll be returning to Backlund soon. With this in mind, Klein silently calculated when Wuxia would be born. He didn't make an accurate recollection, but based on his impressions, Wuxia had been conceived last November, and it was currently only the middle of April. Therefore, he will be born in July? Perhaps earlier. Klein thought without great certainty. After all, he didn't have a girlfriend or wife in his previous life, much less having a child. He quickly threw those thoughts to the back of his mind and began setting up the ritual. He sacrificed the giant's key to himself. The reason why he didn't use his spirit body to carry it, it was simply because it was too heavy. Soon, he arrived above the gray fog. He made the iron-black key fly onto the surface of the bronze table as he seriously inspected it a few times. After confirming that there wasn't anything abnormal about it, he conjured a pen and paper and wrote the divination statement, the place this key corresponds to. With the paper in hand and his arm around the key, Klein leaned back into his chair and fell asleep while chanting. This time, the gray, hazy world first presented a distorted translucent screen. As the scene zoomed in, he immediately appeared before a 10-meter-tall door. The door was mainly blue in color and on its sides were various engraved symbols, labels, and patterns. They were stately and mysterious. The light of dusk shone over faintly, dyeing the door with a clear sense of decline. It was like the daylight was gone for the world, with only eternal darkness replacing it. Right on the heels of that, Klein noticed at the opening in the door's left side, at a height of 3 to 4 meters, there was a pitch-black socket which was equivalent to an adult's fist. The scene quickly shattered as Klein opened his eyes. A door similar to the black cloisters but of a different color. The light of dusk. My interpretation is that it represents a particular door of the giant king's court. Yes, the first distorted translucent screen should be the barrier between the forsaken land of the gods and the outside world. Therefore, without the gray mist eliminating interference, there's no way to see the scene via divination. Klein tapped on the edge of the model table as he made judgment. He had already decided to buy the giant's key. After going through the hassle of bringing £5,000 in cash back to the real world, Klein tidied the items on the table and held a thick stack of cash. He left his room once again and walked to the captain's cabin. As a desire apostle, Curtius's bounty is equivalent to a key and £1,000. Klein glanced at the cash in his hand as he knocked on Vice Admiral Iceberg's door again. With a creak, Edwina appeared by the door. When she saw him holding the cash, her brows twitched as she widened her eyes. She said with a brightened expression, "You have results?" Klein tersely acknowledged. "I already obtained results that it's likely related to the Giant King's court." The Giant King's court as spoken in myths? Edwina's eyes lit up as she asked. Klein gently nodded in affirmation. Edwina's lips quivered as though she wished to inquire further, but ultimately, she didn't say a word. She took the £5,000 in cash. She turned back to look at the rows of bookshelves in the captain's cabin and fell silent. She finally said to Klein seconds later, "If you're interested in these books, you can borrow them any time in the day. My only request is..." Klein secretly predicted what Vice Admiral Iceberg was about to say. "My only request is that you can talk to me about history whenever you're free." Edwina paused before she added with her eyes appearing bright. Klein chuckled inwardly and said after some thought, "All right, but I will not answer every question." Meanwhile, he silently prayed inwardly, "Let's hope Vice Admiral Iceberg's collection has methods to create higher-level charms." "No problem." The corner of Edwina's mouth twitched as her expression became livelier. "See you tomorrow." Klein took off his hat and pressed it to his chest as he bowed to bid farewell. Edwina also seriously returned the pleasantries. "See you tomorrow." Backlund. Iron Gate Street, outside Braveheart's bar. Emlyn White got off a carriage, pushed open a wooden door, and walked in. He was then triggered by the mixture of smells inside as he pinched his nose in contempt. He hadn't had much progress in the competition to hunt for the primordial moon believers, therefore, he planned on heading to the Braveheart's bar which Sherlock Moriarty often mentioned. He was there to find the rather informed black market arms dealer, Ian. The latter's name was acquired by Emlyn through other means. Chapter 706, That Man Turning His Body to the Side. Emlyn avoided a bulldozing drunkard. While swatting his clothes with a frown, he continued jostling towards the bar counter. During this process, he didn't seem to be doing anything, but the surrounding customers would always fail to touch him. Be it in terms of speed, agility, or his balance and coordination, he had reached a rather terrifying level. Finally, Emlyn arrived at the bar counter as he rapped the wooden counter. "Where's Ian?" The bartender glanced at him. Without a word, he kept his head low and wiped his glass cups. Emlyn stood there in surprise, wondering if he had done something wrong that earned him nothing. This angered him a little as he wished to reach out and yank the bartender out. However, he believed that such acts were lacking as a gentleman. He forcefully held down his emotions and looked around and discovered that everyone was drinking. With a thought, Emlyn experimented by saying, "A cup of warmer red wine." The bartender's actions paused as he looked up and gave the handsome, black-haired, red-eyed man an odd look. "We don't have that available." This was the finest red wine in the world. The price was staggering. Emlyn wasn't dumb, and he could tell from the bartender's eyes that he had ordered something he shouldn't have. On careful thought, he said, "1 glass of Southville beer. 5 pence. The bartender finally lowered the cup and cloth. Emlyn took out a 1 solely note and said, "Keep the change." "Thank you." The bartender pointed left and said, "Ian is in card room 1. Emlyn immediately smiled, feeling happy and proud that he had resolved an actual problem. He didn't take the cup of Southville beer and, instead, turned around and walked straight to card room 1. Knock. 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 He politely knocked on the door. "Please come on in." A rather adolescent voice sounded. Emlyn adjusted his collar and pushed open the door, only to realize that the scene inside was unlike what he had expected. He believed that since it was a card room, there would be a bunch of people surrounding a long table, playing games like Texas, but to his surprise, there were indeed about 8 people, but there weren't any poker cards. A piece of paper was placed in front of every participant as they seemed to be recording something. Apart from that, there were only fountain pens and multi-faced dice on the table. Emlyn instinctively cast his gaze on the youngest person inside. It was similarly a handsome boy with red eyes. He looked about 16. "Ian?" Emlyn asked. Ian nodded with a smile. "That's me." "Sir, is there something I can help you with? Or do you wish to join our game?" "Game?" Emlyn returned with a question. Ian chuckled. "Yes, game. I don't enjoy playing cards or billiards, but something needs to be done when spending the whole day here. I gained some inspiration from Emperor Roselle's biography. It's to organize a few people to sit down and attempt a tabletop adventure. In this game, as long as you abide by the rules, you can be anyone: a doctor, an adventurer who loves eating vegetables, a private detective who always carries a wrench and pipe, or an adventurer who enjoys radical ideas. Together, they can head to some ancient castle and seek out the history hidden within, battling all kinds of monsters along the way. Sounds a little interesting. Emlyn had a feeling that this game suited him well. Do you want to join? We're currently embroiled in a ploy and are facing a powerful ancient vampire. He appears to have a handsome face, but beneath his skin are boils formed from his boiling blood. Ian warmly invited him. "Sanguine, thank you very much." Emlyn's expression twitched indiscernibly as he directly said, "I have a mission for you." "All right. Let's go to the room next door." Ian took his round hat and old satchel and stood up. The billiard room next door had no one in it. The boy closed the door with great familiarity as he surveyed the area before looking at Emlyn. "Sir, I do not know you. Might I know who introduced you?" Emlyn lifted his chin and smiled. "Sherlock Moriarty." Just as he said that, he suddenly looked left and right as he raised his hand to pinch his nose. "So it's Detective Moriarty." Ian heaved a sigh of relief without hiding it. I'm assured then. By the way, didn't he go on vacation to Desi Bay? When will he be back? Emlyn lowered his right hand as he said without a change in expression, he isn't back yet. I've been to his rented apartment. To be frank, a normal vacation should have ended by the end of January. It's already April. Could it be that something happened to him? Ian asked worriedly. Emlyn recalled the powers and mysteriousness which Sherlock Moriarty presented as he shook his head. Perhaps he's caught up in a complicated case. Ian didn't speak further as he asked, how may I address you? What mission do you have? You can call me Mr. White. Emlyn took out a piece of paper that resembled a bounty notice. Help me find these 5 people. Ian received it and carefully flipped through it for a while. £20 for an effective clue, £150 for an exact location. Is that acceptable? No problem. Emlyn felt that the price was just too cheap. Compared to this, the prices seen at the Tarot Club were way more exaggerated. Ian folded the piece of paper and said, Mr. White, how do I contact you if I have any clues? South of the bridge, Harvest Church. Emlyn had already thought of the answer. Upon hearing that, Ian gave him an odd look. You're a believer of Mother Earth? That's rare in Backland. I'm not. Emlyn firmly shook his head. I'm only doing volunteer work over there. Without waiting for Ian to speak, he asked, how did you inherit those red eyes? This was something he had wished to ask when he first saw Ian. This was because red eyes were a trademark characteristic of Sanguine in ancient times. However, there was a long period of time when humans and Sanguine copulated in the 4th epoch. They were all residents of an empire, hence, with the widespread fellowship, many descendants were produced. There was an increasing number of red-eyed mixed bloods as they passed down their genes, becoming an uncommon eye color for humans. To put it simply, every red-eyed human had a Sanguine ancestor. Ian replied in surprise, my father. I've no idea how much further up the family tree, as I was a vagabond. From the looks of it, he isn't connected to the Sanguine. Emlyn handed over a £20 deposit, feeling somewhat disappointed before turning to leave the billiard room. After he left, Ian didn't immediately return to the card room. Instead, he closed the door and said into the air, Detective Moriarty hasn't returned to Backland. I'm a little worried about him. A figure suddenly appeared in the billiard room. She had a pale face with exquisite features while wearing a black bonnet. Dressed in a black Gothic regal dress, she was none other than Wraith Sharon. He's doing fine, Sharon replied without any perturbation in her tone. Her figure dematerialized before vanishing. You always says the same thing. Don't tell me that you've always been in contact with Detective Moriarty, Ian mumbled softly as he picked up a newspaper in the corner of the billiard room. Placed on it was the Tussock Times, and beneath it was News at Sea. The latter was mainly used to report the situations of the different colonies of the Lone Kingdom and matters at sea, but due to technological restrictions, the news at sea that reached Backland was severely outdated. It wasn't of much use to people who needed it, so subscription numbers were low, and the business was floundering. Later, with a suggestion from a new chief editor, the newspaper's style changed. It had more rumors out at sea, as well as all sorts of strange matters revolving pirates and adventurers. It appeared more like stories rather than actual news reports. To people's surprise, this change in style was welcomed. As it involved ghosts, specters, sea monsters, and treasures, it became the semi-literate people's prime choice to flaunt their knowledge to the illiterate at the various bars. After all, although the stories seemed fake, they were sufficiently interesting. Ian casually flipped through the newspapers without finding any content of interest. He only had a deep impression on one of the reports in News at Sea. According to our correspondent, on the night of the March 25th, the King of Immortality fleet attacked a ship heading from East Balam to Faysac and plundered all its goods and money. And living up to his title, Slaughterer Curtius finished a bloody massacre. These pirates are really preposterous. Ian shook his head and lowered the newspapers. He returned to the card room and continued his game. Outside the bar, Emlyn boarded a carriage and leaned onto the carriage wall as he watched the street lamps move past him. He pinched his nose again and silently muttered, "A wraith? This arms dealer sure is resourceful. Not bad." Emlyn closed his eyes as he felt more hopeful about his entrusted mission. The sunlight shone in from outside, dyeing the captain's cabin golden. Edwina sat on a chair with a book in hand as she looked opposite her. "So, you also believe that the Solomon, Trunsoist, and Tudor empires all coexisted? This is a necessary condition for the War of the Four Emperors," Klein simply replied. He held a book titled Book of the Three Worlds. It originated from a life school of thought member before it landed in Vice Admiral Iceberg's hands. It described the material world, the spirit world, and the world beyond rationality. It included some information on charms, with rather profound parts. Klein was seriously reading information on this in a bid to better use the Sea God Scepter and the Worm of Time. Klein had actually discovered that the books collected by Vice Admiral Iceberg were various ancient texts that were rather unsystematic. This was quite different from the characteristics of the Church of the God of Knowledge and Wisdom which backed her. Therefore, he guessed that the internal, orthodox, systematic mysticism knowledge of the Church was not public. Edwina was just about to ask again when she suddenly realized the Golden Dream's cruising speed gradually drop. She looked out the window and after a few looks, said crisply, "We've arrived in Biyao." Chapter 707, Danitz request. We've reached Biyao. Klein stood up upon hearing that and looked out. He saw the familiar Resistance's private harbor. He didn't show his surprise as he commented calmly, "Faster than I expected." It was 3 hours faster than he had expected. "It's faster than I expected as well." Edwina looked away and agreed with Gehrman Sparrow. "However, these are all unimportant details." Klein lowered his head, pretending as though he was browsing through the rest of the Book of the Three Worlds. He then handed it to Vice Admiral Iceberg. "That marks the end of this discussion." Edwina looked at the book in silence. She opened her mouth, but no words came out. She reached for the Book of the Three Worlds and placed it on the table in passing. Following that, she got up and bowed. "I look forward to future discussions with you. Your expertise in ancient history is admirable." If Klein had been acting as himself, he would have said a few words of humility while praising Vice Admiral Iceberg for her breadth of knowledge. Unfortunately, he was the crazy adventurer, Gehrman Sparrow. All he did was nod and say, "We are collaborators." It meant that there would be opportunities in the future. He didn't speak further as he left the captain's cabin and returned to his room. He packed his suitcase with a relaxed mind, waited for the Golden Dream to dock, and then headed straight for the deck. At that moment, there were many crew members gathered on the deck. It included gourmet Brew Walls, singer Orpheus, and flowery bow-tie Jodson, most of the crew who were upper echelon members of the pirate crew with their heads worth a handsome bounty. They gave sincere smiles as they happily kept waving at Klein. Among them, Beryl and Iron Skin were filled with excitement as they belted out a song for their departing guest. "When did I have such a good relationship with them?" Klein lampooned as he walked past the pirates until he arrived at the gangway. Anderson Hood was there with his hair combed, his clothes neat and tidy. He said with a laugh, "They probably mean to say goodbye, or should I say, let's hope we don't meet again. Gehrman, do you know how dangerous a situation you were in? You nearly became the public enemy of every crew member." They were so eager to steer the Golden Dream to Biyao in 5 minutes. Klein was just about to answer when he saw Danitz jog over with a black cloak draped over him. "This fellow has really resolved himself to do better, and he plans to leave the Golden Dream to go at it alone? This is a little incompatible with my plans. Only by being around Vice Admiral Iceberg and the Church of the God of Knowledge and Wisdom would his value as a believer of the Fool be accentuated. However, it doesn't matter. If Danitz can grow stronger, it will be even more meaningful." Klein habitually measured the pros and cons before ignoring his other thoughts. He looked at Danitz in silence and waited for him to speak. Danitz opened his mouth with a serious expression, but nothing came out of it. All he did was give a hollow chuckle and say to Anderson, "Do you have the potion formula for Conspirer?" "Yes," Anderson said with a chuckle. "But I have no plans on selling it to you." Danitz's expression darkened as Anderson continued, unfazed. "What's the point of obtaining the Conspirer potion formula now? Any attempts to advance now will only result in failure. Pal, it's best you redo your acting as a hunter, followed by a provoker, and then a pyromaniac. Heh, it's best that you get an artisan to make that giant's heart into a defensive mystical item. Otherwise, I'm afraid you would be killed by others when the time comes. After you're sure about your chances, get the Conspirer potion formula from your captain. She has it. However, I believe that will be the end for you. Heh, Conspirer has very high requirements." Danitz's face twitched as he was being mocked, but he remembered every word Anderson told him. This was because the man before him had the title of Strongest Hunter, who had rich experience on this pathway. Furthermore, he had a vague idea that the key was acting. He suspected that the captain's guidance from before was directed at this, just that it was rather vague. "There will come a day when I'll let you know what a true conspirer is," Danitz stubbornly retorted before looking at Gehrman Sparrow. He cleared his throat as he said without daring to look into his eyes, "I've already made the request with Captain. In the future, I'll be in contact with the Resistance, and I'll often be in Biyao. It means you don't wish to leave the Golden Dream, but you will find opportunities to hone yourself? Heh, why does it feel like you're reporting to your boss?" Klein chuckled inwardly as he gave a terse answer. Danitz was instantly relieved as he felt a lot better. If it wasn't because his companions were watching behind him, he would have diligently helped Gehrman Sparrow carry his suitcase and send him all the way to the dock. After watching Gehrman and Anderson leave, he cautiously decided to pray to the Fool every day starting tonight. He wanted to show his devotion to prevent any accidents from happening to him. Inside the Resistance's private harbor, Anderson watched as Gehrman Sparrow circled into another newly built road before walking out of the woods via the shortest distance. "You seem familiar with this place?" "This road wasn't here the last time I was here," Anderson said, partially bored and poignant. "Of course, there are so many people praying to me every day telling me what they've done, and I occasionally give them a response, such as directing them to mend this road." Klein thought smugly but replied with a stoic expression, "Where does your friend stay?" "In a manor in the Biyao city outskirts." Anderson sped up his pace as he led the way. An hour later, he brought Klein to a manor. There was an eclectic smell from various spices, mixed with an indescribable ersatz exoticism. After informing the gatekeeper of their intentions, the two didn't wait long before they saw a man of medium-sized build of less than 1.75 meters walk over. By his side were his butler and valet. The man's skin was somewhat sallow, with quite a tan. His contours were gentle, but his eye sockets were much more recessed than most Loanese. To Klein, he could basically determine the man's background. He was a Highlander from the Fainapotter kingdom. The man was already a little plump, with a rotund, amiable face. He immediately laughed when he saw the Strongest Hunter. "Anderson, you aren't dead yet?" "I'm waiting to attend your funeral," Anderson replied without standing on ceremony. He then turned sideways to Klein. "Ukfa Connor Chris, the doctor of my former team." He didn't introduce Gehrman Sparrow to Ukfa and said with a grin, "I've brought you business." Ukfa instantly understood Anderson and didn't ask in front of his butler and valet. He led the duo towards the main building in the manor. Along the way, Klein saw buildings like windmills, bakery, brewery, and militia training grounds. The entire manor appeared like a miniaturized kingdom. Apart from the lack of a blacksmith, it was completely self-sufficient. Most iron products were cheaper buying them from the city than personally making them. This is the pastoral lifestyle. Klein sighed silently as he followed Ukfa into the house and to his study. Ukfa didn't call the mistress of the house over, nor did he carry his child to meet Anderson and Klein. Clearly, he didn't wish for them to have any contact with the mysterious world. Hence, after he closed the door, he went straight to the point. "What's the business? Didn't you wish to sell that revolver?" "He has intentions on buying it." Anderson pointed at Klein. Gehrman Sparrow. Gehrman Sparrow? The powerful adventurer who easily hunted Wormtongue Myther? Ukfa said in surprise, but he didn't show any fear. Although he had distanced himself from the adventuring lifestyle, he knew that he couldn't be careless. Therefore, while in Biyao, he would proactively keep himself informed to prevent trouble from happening. Anderson scoffed when he heard that. That's old news. This gentleman's achievements include successfully hunting slaughterer Curtius while living to this day. Curtius? The second mate of the King of Immortality? Ukfa's expression changed. He couldn't hide his horror as he secretly turned wary. That's right. Anderson said with a self-deprecating smile. In the pirates' playground, he's the one who's recognized as the strongest hunter. Ukfa gulped as he looked at Klein. He couldn't help but smile and say, I believe you have the ability to buy Death Knell. Death Knell? Klein asked with piqued interest, but he didn't show it. That's the name of the revolver. It has accompanied me for a decade. Sigh, if it's not because it overlaps in functionality with one of my other mystical items, and isn't of much use for me at present, I wouldn't be willing to sell it, Ukfa replied with a sigh. At that moment, Anderson scared with laughter. That wasn't what you said before. You said you preferred farming tools. A planter. Klein made the corresponding judgment based on Anderson's words and Ukfa's expression. Meanwhile, the corresponding potion names flashed through his mind: Sequence 9 Planter, Sequence 8 Doctor with the ancient name Healing Pastor, and Sequence 7 Harvest Priest. It's no wonder Anderson introduced him as his former team's doctor. Klein thought for a moment and said, Do you know Frank Lee? No. Although I'm from Phaenopotter, my formula and ingredients were obtained by myself, one at a time. I had nothing to do with the Church of Mother Earth. Therefore, I wouldn't dare to return to Phaenopotter. However, I've heard of Frank Lee. He's someone who gives the Church quite a headache, Ukfa replied frankly. He's only a Sequence 6 biologist, but he's given such importance by the Church. I really do wish to meet him if there's a chance. No, you won't, you will regret having that thought. Klein could tell from Ukfa's answer that he believed in Mother Earth and was likely a powerful Sequence 5 Beyonder. By his side, Anderson's face twitched when he heard Ukfa. He said with lingering fear, that guy does give one a headache. In a certain sense, you can call him a devil. His powers and thoughts have exceeded the level of a Sequence 6. Alright, let's not talk about him. Whenever his name pops up, I still remember the milk that was jettisoned. Ukfa looked at the duo in puzzlement as he restrained his looks of curiosity. He walked to the table's side, opened a drawer, and pulled out an iron black revolver that looked a little longer than an ordinary revolver. This is Death Knell, Ukfa introduced it solemnly. Chapter 708, Revolver worth £9,000 Death Knell? Striking the enemy's death knell with every shot. I like this name. Klein controlled his facial expressions as he went forward without any anticipation or excitement on his face. He reached out to receive the iron black revolver with a slightly long barrel. He was originally very worried that Ukfa would raise the price if he showed any strong desires for it. This was common in any transaction, but on second thought, with Gehrman Sparrow's reputation, and with Anderson, the strongest hunter of the Fog Sea, as a witness, it was unlikely that Ukfa Connor Chris would offend him despite possibly being a Sequence 5 Beyonder. After all, he had quite the adventuring circles and had hoped to lead a quiet and settled life. He definitely had reservations that the crazy adventurer might sneak into the manor in the middle of the night despite not flaring up in front of him. Therefore, his attempts to maintain his calm and composed attitude became one of simply maintaining his persona. Realizing that Gehrman Sparrow was seriously inspecting and studying Death Knell, Ukfa gave a detailed introduction. Its powers are rather uniform: to reap the lives of others. There are 3 methods. First is weakness attack. There's no need to meet any conditions. Just directly inject your spirituality and pull the trigger. It will allow you to discover the target's weaknesses from a mysticism angle. In other words, it would be the aspects where defenses are weaker, and it will provide you with the corresponding accuracy, thus, resulting in extraordinarily terrifying damage. The second is lethal attack. You have to cock the hammer before shooting. Its distinguishing feature is that wherever you hit the target, it will be equivalent to an attack on their weak spot. And if you really do strike the true weak spot, it will be capable of dealing a lethal blow to an enemy without overly strong defenses. To targets who are good at defending, 3 shots would be able to resolve the matter. This includes Guardian. Of course, that is under the premise that the 3 lethal blows aren't spread too far apart. It's best not to exceed 5 seconds. The third is slaughtering. On the foundation of a weakness attack, providing more than twice the spirituality on top of that will imbue ordinary bullets with grapeshot effects. Simultaneously, when aimed at a group of enemies, it will result in area of effect damage. To increase the damage, it will need to meet the conditions for lethal attack, as well as provide more than thrice the spirituality. This drain will be quite a burden on the user. It can also be combined with bullets with different characteristics, allowing you to target different kinds of enemies. This sounds like it corresponds to a sequence 5 Reaper of the Hunter pathway. Klein glanced at Anderson and asked, seemingly in thought, if the target's physical condition reaches that of a sequence 4 dragon, how many strikes of lethal attack will kill it? Ukfa was taken aback as he shook his head in a daze. I've never met a dragon before. Much less a dragon whose physical condition has reached that of a demigod. Does Gehrman Sparrow plan on using this gun to slay dragons? And a demigod dragon at that? Isn't that way too crazy? Ukfa suddenly felt that the adventurers these days were completely different from the ones he met back when he was active. He didn't even consider the possibility of death. Anderson coughed before clearing his throat. That will depend on your luck. For real, trust me, luck is extremely important. If you encounter a dragon that has been beaten to a state close to death, then 1 shot would be sufficient. Otherwise, I suggest you to run. Yes, it's more important to stay alive. Of course, if the demigod dragon doesn't defend and stays there for you hit it, 5 shots of lethal attacks should be enough to kill it. Ukfa looked at Anderson before looking at Gehrman Sparrow. He decided not to pursue the topic as he changed topics. Anderson has told you about the negative effects of death knell, right? You will receive a weakness that originally didn't exist, or it will enhance an already existing weakness, making it become more extreme. This effect will be maintained for 6 hours. There was once a time when I became extremely afraid of cats. There was one when I had just hunted a famous pirate, but I ended up going limp in the legs in front of a newborn kitten. I knelt before it, wailing and crying for it to spare me. If you carry it around, the problems aren't great. It will only make you easily thirsty. Just drinking more water and heading to the washroom more often would solve the problem. Why does it feel like the negative effects of an additional weakness will bring me more trouble? However, it is something acceptable. Klein deliberated and said, name your price. 9,000 pounds. Anderson should have mentioned it. That's my bottom line. Ukfa looked at death knell in Gehrman Sparrow's hands and said, this is already cheap enough. If it wasn't because I was worried that getting to know more Beyonders would affect my present life, I would have actively promoted it. I'm sure I can sell it for 12,000 pounds. Indeed, a mystical item at this level can be sold for sky-high prices if the negative effects aren't too serious when meeting a suitable buyer. Normally speaking, 10,000 to 12,000 pounds is a reasonable price. Although Klein had the intention of bargaining, the price was already low enough that he felt embarrassed to try and take advantage of him. With a terse acknowledgement, he said, I'll give it a run. I'll complete the deal if there aren't any problems. Of course, he didn't really try the gun, as it would give him a weakness for nothing. His method for inspection was to use his spirituality to probe the gun, along with testing for the credibility of Ukfa's words via divination. He did it rather openly, without minding Ukfa's and Anderson's gazes. I'll make confirmation later above the grey fog. However, Ukfa likely doesn't dare to lie to me. He's definitely afraid of a crazy adventurer seeking revenge on him. After all, he has already obtained a settled and quiet life. He has a wife and children. Klein placed death knell on the table, lifted his suitcase, and took out 9,000 pounds from it. The money had been removed from above the grey fog to air it ahead of time. After Ukfa received the money, he did a quick count and confirmed the authenticity of the money. As expected of a recently famous adventurer. Few people can produce 9,000 pounds in cash at once. Even a tycoon doesn't have that much liquidity, he said poignantly as he put away the stacks of cash. I even spent 5,000 pounds to buy a key not long ago. Klein felt his heart suddenly turn empty as he saw the 9,000 pounds enter Ukfa's drawer. I've been out at sea for so long, saving up so much money, but in just moments, it's all gone. Now, I'm left with 2,683 pounds and 6 gold coins. I can't even afford a relatively decent manor. Klein sighed as he took out the ordinary revolver from his underarm holster, removed the bullets inside, and stuffed them into death knell. After Anderson watched the entire transaction, he said with a TSK, Ukfa, you've changed. In the past, you would have checked the authenticity of each note. If you find it troublesome, I can help you. It's totally fine, but I'm worried that Gehrman will shoot you. Ukfa clearly knew the strongest hunter's talent at provocation. He could imagine the scene of Anderson posing in a way that was begging to be beaten, counting each and every note while verifying them against the light in slow motion. Well said. Klein silently praised him. He then stuffed the iron black, long-barreled revolver into his underarm holster. The original revolver was thrown inside the suitcase. Thanks to you, I no longer have to fret over this matter, Ukfa said with a smile as he pointed at the door. I'll get my valet to send you out. Anderson opened his mouth as he chuckled. Ukfa, aren't you going to keep us here for dinner? When you're married with kids, I'll treat you to the best food at the best restaurant, Ukfa said with a smile, completely unfazed by his accusation. Out of the manor, Anderson looked up with squinted eyes. At the sight of the setting sun, he chuckled. Back when I knew Ukfa, he was a doctor who was good at planting all kinds of strange plants on the ship to improve everyone's lives. I thought he would die early on during our adventures, but to my surprise, he was always lucky. He even became a druid later. Why are your poignant words also so deserving of a beating? Klein deliberately said, he does have good luck. As your companion, luck is needed to survive. Anderson turned his head in surprise as he scrutinized Gehrman's sparrow. You know how to mock others? Or have you been infected by me? He wasn't too affected by it as he straightened his clothes, took off his hat, and said with a smile, all right, you've gotten the mystical item you need. If there's nothing else, it's time I embark on my own journey. Don't forget that demigod's mission. Klein succeeded in using a single sentence to crumple Anderson's expression. I already have an urge that compels me to finish that matter as soon as possible. All right, there's no need for goodbyes. Perhaps we might really meet again one day. Anderson gave a self-deprecating laugh, waved the hat in his hand, and turned to head towards another path that left to Biyao. As he watched the strongest hunter depart, Klein slowly heaved a sigh. Holding his suitcase, he followed the path he took to get here and headed for Biyao under the red evening sky and the shelter of unique palm trees. Inside Biyao City. After finding an ordinary inn to stay in, Klein began considering his subsequent plans. I'm finally free. I can attempt to act as a marionettist. I have to figure out the corresponding principles. That's the most pressing issue for now. Yes, marionettist. The focus should be on the marionette. I haven't actually created a marionette and controlled it in battle. I should start from there. This matter can be completed before returning to Backlund. Not only do Beyonders have to stay hidden there, making it difficult to encounter one, but no matter what one does, it's easy to get on the bad side of the church or some important figure. I need to be careful. It's not a good place to select and create marionettes. The sea is better. I'll go make my rounds at the bar later. I'll find a pirate who deserves death to give it a try. With this in mind, Klein immediately got up and left his room. As though he was bringing his certificate of deposit to a bank to withdraw the money, he headed for the nearby seaweed bar. Famous pirates often showed up there. Soon, he arrived at the bar's entrance. After straightening his clothes, he pushed open the heavy wooden door. Gazes subconsciously swept past his face before they moved away as though it wasn't anything extraordinary. Following that, someone shouted with a suppressed voice, "Gairman Sparrow." In a blink of an eye, several figures in the bar ran for the back door. Before Klein could figure out what was happening, the bar was left relatively desolate and empty. You're tuning into the Biyao's Wuxia Chronicles YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.